You knew it was wrong before you could explain why. Picture it. A man on a crowded train reaches into the bag of the woman beside him and lifts out her wallet while she looks the other way. You see it happen, and something in you moves before a single word of reasoning forms. Not a thought, not an argument, a flinch. A recoil that arrives ahead of your mind, faster than language, faster than justification, a verdict delivered by some part of you that had already decided before the deciding part of you woke up. The wrongness was not concluded, it was felt, and the speed of that feeling, the sheer impossible speed of it, is the first clue that something strange is happening inside the human moral sense, something that the neuroscience of the last 3 decades has measured with increasing precision, and that the contemplative traditions named, in their own vocabularies, thousands of years before any brain was ever scanned. The flinch comes first. This is the finding, stated plainly, that overturned a 2,000-year-old assumption about how human beings make moral judgments. The assumption, inherited from Plato and refined by every rationalist philosopher since, was that moral judgment is a reasoning process that we encounter, a situation, weigh the considerations, apply our principles, and arrive at a conclusion about right and wrong. The mind deliberates, the verdict follows. But when Jonathan Haidt, working at the University of Virginia in the early 2000s, began presenting people with morally charged scenarios and measuring the sequence of their responses, he found the order reversed. The judgment came first, instantly, intuitively. The reasoning came afterward, scrambling to justify a verdict that had already been reached. Haidt called this social intuitionism, and the central image he used to describe it was a lawyer defending a client who has already been chosen. The intuition is the client, the reasoning is the lawyer. The conscience does not deliberate its way to a conclusion. It arrives at the conclusion and then hires the intellect to defend it. This is not a marginal effect. Haidt demonstrated it through what he called moral dumbfounding, the phenomenon in which people maintain a strong moral conviction even after every reason they can offer for it has been dismantled. He would present a scenario carefully constructed so that no actual harm occurred, no one was wronged, no rule was broken in any way the person could articulate. And yet the person would insist, with total certainty, that the act was wrong. Asked why, they would offer a reason. The reason would be shown to be inapplicable. They would offer another. It too would fail. And eventually they would say, "I cannot explain it, but I know it is wrong." The conviction outlasted every justification. The flinch was bedrock. The reasons were scaffolding built on top of it, and when the scaffolding was removed, the bedrock remained, something in the human person knows before it can say. And every contemplative tradition that ever examined the moral sense reached the same conclusion through introspection that Haidt reached through experiment. That conscience is not a conclusion but a perception, not a verdict reasoned toward, but a reality directly seen. And here the science deepens, because the flinch is not merely fast, it is physical. Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist working at the University of Iowa and later the University of Southern California, I spent decades studying patients with damage to a specific region of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a patch of tissue behind the forehead where emotion and decision-making intersect. These patients retained their intelligence. Their logical reasoning was intact. Their memory functioned. Their capacity to describe moral rules in the abstract was unimpaired. And yet they became, in a precise and devastating sense, morally and practically broken. They could state what was right. They could not feel it. And without the feeling, the knowledge was inert. Damasio formulated this into the somatic marker hypothesis, the proposal that the body itself participates in judgment, that decisions are tagged with bodily emotional signals, a tightening, a warmth, a recoil, and that these somatic markers are not interference with rational judgment, but its necessary foundation. The flinch you feel watching the wallet lifted from the bag is a somatic marker. It is your body rendering a verdict. And when the tissue that produces that verdict is destroyed, the verdict vanishes, and the person is left knowing the words for morality while having lost the thing the words point to. Consider what this means. The Hindu tradition speaks of the antarayamin, the inner controller, the witness seated in the heart who observes every action and knows its moral quality directly, without deliberation, as an immediate seeing. The Upanishadic sages did not arrive at this through brain imaging. They arrived at it through sustained introspective attention to the structure of their own experience, and they reported finding within themselves a witnessing presence that registered the rightness and wrongness of action, with a directness that bypassed thought entirely. When Damasio locates moral judgment in a bodily emotional system that operates faster than, and prior to conscious reasoning, he is mapping, in the vocabulary of neuroscience, the same structure that the tradition mapped in the vocabulary of contemplation: the witness in the heart, the somatic marker in the body, the flinch that arrives before the argument. 3 descriptions, 3 methods, 1 phenomenon. The bodily nature of conscience runs deeper still into the machinery by which one person registers the inner state of another. In the 1990s, a team of neuroscientists led by Giacomo Rizzolatti at the University of Parma discovered, almost by accident, that certain neurons in the brains of macaque monkeys fired not only when the animal performed an action, but also when it merely watched another perform the same action. These mirror neurons, as they came to be called, suggested a mechanism by which the actions and intentions of others are mapped directly onto one's own motor and emotional systems, as if the boundary between self and other were, at the neural level, partly dissolved. Subsequent work on the human anterior insula, a region buried deep in the cortex, demonstrated that when you witness another person in pain, the very regions that would activate, were you yourself in pain, become active in your own brain. You do not merely infer that the other suffers. At the level of neural response, you suffer with them, faintly, automatically, before any conscious act of sympathy. This is the biological substrate of empathy, and it is the substrate of conscience as well, because the flinch you feel when you watch the wallet stolen is in part the registration, in your own body, of the violation done to another body. The wrong is felt as if it were done to you, because in the neural economy it partly is. The Buddhist tradition built an entire ethical path on precisely this insight. Karuna, compassion, is not in Buddhist understanding a sentiment one cultivates by effort against the grain of a fundamentally separate self. It is the natural expression of seeing through the illusion of separation, the recognition that the suffering of another is not categorically distinct from one's own. The bodhisattva, the figure who vows to seek liberation for the sake of all beings, embodies the extension of this recognition to its limit, a moral sensitivity so complete that the boundary between self-interest and the interest of others has become transparent. When the neuroscientists locate, in the mirror systems and the shared circuits of the insula, a biological mechanism by which the suffering of others is registered as one's own, they are describing the physical underpinning of what the Buddhist tradition described as the dissolution of the illusory boundary between beings. The compassion the tradition prescribed and the empathy the science measured are the same capacity, seen from the inside and from the outside. The mapping grows more precise. Joshua Greene, working at Princeton University and later Harvard, took the moral sense into the brain scanner. Greene used the famous trolley dilemma scenarios in which a person must choose whether to sacrifice one life to save 5 and varied them in a crucial way. In one version, you pull a lever to divert a runaway trolley away from 5 people and onto a track where it kills 1. In another version, you must physically push a large man off a footbridge to stop the trolley, his body halting it before it reaches the 5. The arithmetic is identical. 1 dies, 5 live. But the moral feeling is utterly different. Most people will pull the lever. Most people will not push the man. And Greene, watching their brains as they decided, saw why. The impersonal version, the lever, activated regions associated with cool cost-benefit calculation. The personal version, the push, activated regions associated with emotional response, the same circuitry that generates the flinch. When the violence became personal, became a matter of your hands on another person's body, an emotional alarm fired, and the alarm overrode the arithmetic. The conscience is not a calculator. The conscience is, in part, a system of alarms, and the alarms are wired to fire before the calculation finishes. The detail of Greene's findings is worth dwelling on, because it reveals the architecture of the moral brain with unusual clarity. When subjects contemplated the personal dilemma, the pushing of the man from the bridge, Greene observed heightened activity in the medial prefrontal cortex and regions associated with emotional processing, and crucially, he found that the small minority of subjects who did endorse pushing the man took measurably longer to reach that judgment, as though they had to override an emotional signal before the cold arithmetic could prevail. The flinch fired first. Endorsing the sacrifice required suppressing it, and the suppression took time, and the time was visible in the data. This is the signature of a dual-process moral mind, a fast, automatic, emotionally driven system that delivers immediate verdicts, and a slower, deliberate, calculating system that can sometimes override them, but must work against their grain to do so. The conscience, in this picture, is not a single faculty but a contest, and the first voice to speak in that contest is always the flinch. Jorge Moll and his colleagues at the National Institutes of Health, scanning the brains of people as they contemplated moral judgments and acts of generosity, found that moral cognition recruits an entire network of regions, not a single moral organ, but a distributed system integrating emotion, social perception, and abstract value, lighting up in concert when the moral sense engages. The conscience is written across the brain the way a melody is written across an orchestra, no single instrument carrying it alone. Greene's interpretation of this was naturalistic. He saw the emotional responses as evolved heuristics, useful approximations shaped by natural selection, sometimes reliable and sometimes misfiring. And this is a serious position that any honest examination must hold open. But notice what the data establishes regardless of interpretation. There is, woven into the structure of the human brain, a moral alarm system that fires automatically, that responds with special intensity to personal violation, and that operates with a speed and a force that conscious reasoning cannot match and frequently cannot override. The Buddhist tradition describes the arising of moral perception in terms that map this with eerie precision. In Buddhist moral psychology, the wholesome and unwholesome qualities of an action are accompanied by distinct mental factors that arise in immediate response to the action's nature, hiri and ottappa, often translated as moral shame and moral dread, the instinctive recoil from what is unwholesome. These were described in the Abhidhamma literature, the systematic Buddhist psychology compiled in the centuries, around the beginning of the Common Era, as factors that arise spontaneously, prior to deliberation, guarding the mind the way a reflex guards the body. The moral alarm, the instinctive recoil, hiri and ottappa, the tradition named the flinch. The evolutionary biologists have an account of where these alarms came from, and it is a powerful account that no honest examination can dismiss. Robert Trivers, working at Harvard in 1971, formulated the theory of reciprocal altruism, the demonstration that cooperation between unrelated individuals can be favored by natural selection when there is a sufficient probability of future interaction, because those who cooperate with cooperators and punish cheaters outcompete those who do not. William Hamilton, the British biologist, had earlier shown through his theory of kin selection that altruism toward genetic relatives can be favored because relatives carry copies of the same genes. Out of these mechanisms, the argument runs, the moral emotions were built: gratitude, guilt, indignation, the sense of fairness, the recoil from betrayal, each one a piece of psychological machinery that made our ancestors better cooperators and therefore more successful at leaving descendants. Franz de Waal, the primatologist working at Emory University, spent decades documenting the building blocks of morality in our closest relatives: chimpanzees who console the distressed, capuchin monkeys who reject unfair distributions of food, the recognizable precursors of human moral emotion present in creatures who never read a commandment. The moral sense, on this account, is not a revelation from beyond. It is an adaptation, as much a product of natural selection as the opposable thumb. This account explains a great deal, and the investigation will take it with full seriousness rather than waving it away. But notice what it explains and what it does not. It explains why we have moral feelings, why the machinery of guilt and indignation and fairness exists in creatures shaped by selection for cooperation. It does not, by itself, explain why those feelings track anything true. An evolved aversion to incest protects against genetic disease, and one could tell a purely functional story about it. But when a person says that betraying a friend is genuinely wrong, not merely disadvantageous, not merely something evolution disposed us to dislike, but wrong, in a way that would remain wrong even if it were advantageous, the evolutionary account has reached the edge of what it can address. It can tell us why we feel the wrongness. It cannot tell us whether the wrongness is real. And this gap between the explanation of the feeling and the status of what the feeling points to is the gap into which every tradition of human wisdom poured its deepest claim about conscience. That the feeling is not the whole story, that the flinch tracks something, that the moral order it dimly registers is as real as the physical order the eye registers when it tracks light. But perhaps the most striking finding is the one that emerges when you stop looking at individual brains and start looking across the entire human species. If conscience were merely a cultural construction, a set of arbitrary rules instilled by particular societies, then we would expect the moral sense to vary wildly from culture to culture, with no underlying structure shared across the human family. And on the surface, moral codes do vary. Particular rules differ, particular taboos differ. But beneath the surface, when researchers look for deep structure, they find something remarkable, a shared architecture of moral concern that appears in every human society ever studied. Haidt and his collaborators, surveying moral systems across cultures, identified recurring foundations, concerns about harm and care, about fairness, about loyalty, about authority, about purity that appear everywhere, in different proportions and with different specific content, but always present, always part of the structure. Anthropologists examining the ethnographic record have found a set of moral rules: help your family, return favors, be brave, defer to legitimate authority, respect others' property that recur in society after society across the globe. The surface varies. The deep structure is universal. The flinch speaks different languages, but it is the same flinch. Donald Brown, the anthropologist, compiled in the 1990s a catalogue of what he called human universals, features found in every human society ever documented. And the catalogue is dense with moral content, concepts of right and wrong, prohibitions against murder and rape within the group, notions of fairness and reciprocity, the recognition of obligations, the experience of guilt and shame. No society has ever been discovered that lacked a moral sense. None has ever been found, in all the records of all the peoples ever studied, in which cruelty was admired without limit and kindness despised, in which the betrayer was honoured and the faithful scorned as a matter of settled principle. No people has ever been found for whom betrayal and cruelty and theft were matters of indifference, governed by no inner prohibition at all. The particular boundaries shift who counts as inside the circle of moral concern, which acts are forbidden, how transgressions are punished, but the existence of the circle, the reality of the prohibition, the presence of the inner law, is constant. A trait that appears in every member of a species, that emerges in infancy before instruction, that operates faster than thought, and is anchored in identifiable neural machinery, is not a cultural accident. It is a feature of the kind of being a human is. And the traditions, observing this same constancy across the peoples they encountered, drew the natural conclusion that what is universal in humanity points to something universal beyond humanity, that the law found everywhere within must have a single source above, and this universality is precisely what the traditions asserted. The Christian tradition, drawing on the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, speaks of a law written on the heart, the claim that even those who never received any explicit moral instruction nonetheless carry within them a knowledge of right and wrong, a law inscribed not on tablets of stone, but on the inner substance of the person. Paul wrote that the requirements of the law are written on human hearts, with conscience bearing witness, the thoughts of the person accusing or defending. Written on the heart, not taught, not constructed, inscribed, as if the moral sense were a feature of the human design rather than an artifact of human culture. The Hindu tradition makes the same claim through the concept of dharma, a word we will return to, because it carries a meaning so important to this entire investigation that it deserves the fullest attention. For now it is enough to say that dharma names a moral order understood not as human invention but as the very structure of reality, a law that the wise perceive within themselves because it is woven into the nature of things. The universality that the cross-cultural research uncovers is the empirical shadow of a claim the traditions made directly, that conscience is not local, not arbitrary, not constructed, but is rather the perception within the individual of something that does not belong to the individual at all. The Christian philosophical tradition gave this inner faculty a technical name. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century and drawing on earlier scholastic distinctions, spoke of synderesis, the innate, unerring disposition of the practical intellect toward the good, the spark of conscience that grasps the first principles of moral action, the way the theoretical intellect grasps the first principles of logic. For Aquinas, synderesis does not reason its way to the knowledge that good is to be done and evil avoided. It simply knows it, immediately, as a starting point from which all moral reasoning proceeds. This is a strikingly precise anticipation of what the cognitive science would later find. A foundational moral intuition that is not itself the product of reasoning, but is the bedrock upon which reasoning is built. Aquinas located it in the structure of the rational soul. The neuroscientist locates it in the structure of the brain. But both are describing a moral knowing that comes first, that is given rather than derived, that functions as the unreasoned foundation of all subsequent moral reason. The flinch is synderesis felt in the body, and the universality extends even into development, into the earliest emergence of the moral sense in the human child. Researchers studying infants in the work of Paul Bloom and Karen Wynne at Yale, among others, have found that babies as young as a few months show preferences for characters who help others over characters who hinder them, reactions that appear before language, before instruction, before the child could possibly have absorbed a culture's moral code. The moral sense does not wait to be taught. It emerges, like vision, like the grasp reflex, as part of the equipment the human being arrives with. This is exactly what one would expect if conscience were, as the traditions claimed, written on the heart, inscribed in the design, rather than installed by the culture. The culture shapes the surface, names the particular rules, directs the moral sense toward its specific objects. But the sense itself, the raw capacity to feel the difference between cruelty and kindness, is there from the beginning, as native to the human creature as the beating of its heart. Return now to the speed, because the speed is the strangest part, and the strangeness is the doorway to everything that follows. When you watch the wallet lifted from the bag, the moral verdict arrives in a fraction of a second. Measured in the laboratory, the effective response to a moral violation can register in the brain within a few hundred milliseconds faster than you can form the sentence describing what you saw, faster than the deliberative regions of the cortex can construct an argument. This is the timing that Benjamin Libet's famous experiments first made visible in the domain of voluntary action, and that subsequent research has extended into the moral domain. The discovery that the conscious, reasoning, narrating self is not the first responder. Something deeper responds first. The narrating self arrives late, finds the verdict already rendered, and tells itself a story in which it did the rendering. But it did not. The flinch preceded it. And the question of what, exactly, rendered that verdict, what part of you knew the wrongness before you did, is a question that neuroscience can locate in the brain but cannot fully dissolve, because locating where a judgment happens is not the same as explaining how a lump of tissue comes to perceive a moral truth at all. The temporal sequence deserves to be made vivid, because it inverts the picture most people carry of themselves as moral agents. You imagine, when you make a moral judgment, that you are the one making it, that your conscious, reasoning self surveys the situation and renders the verdict. But the measurements tell a different story. The effective response arrives first, in the deep and fast circuitry, and only afterward does the conscious self become aware of a judgment that has, in effect, already been made for it. The studies of moral processing extend into the moral domain, a discovery that Benjamin Libet, working at the University of California, San Francisco in the 1980s, first made about voluntary action, that the brain initiates a response before the conscious mind is aware of having decided. In the moral case, this means that the self which believes itself to be the author of its moral judgments is, in a real sense, their spectator, receiving the verdict from below, then constructing the narrative of having reasoned to it. The flinch is the master, the reasoning self is the servant who arrives late and claims the credit. And this is humbling, and it is strange, and it raises with full force the question that the rest of this investigation must confront. If the deepest layer of your moral life operates beneath and before your conscious control, then whose voice is it? What speaks in the flinch? The brain, says the neuroscientist, and that is true as far as it goes. But the traditions, hearing the same voice, insisted that the brain is the instrument and not the source, that what speaks in the flinch speaks through the person from somewhere deeper than the person, and that to trace the moral sense to its origin is to be led, step by step, out of the skull and into the structure of reality itself. This is the gap. Neuroscience can show you the circuitry of conscience. It can map the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, trace the emotional alarms, measure the timing, identify the regions that light up when the flinch fires. All of this is real, established, replicated, beyond serious dispute. But there is a difference between describing the mechanism by which a moral perception is registered and explaining how moral perception is possible at all, how it comes to be that arrangements of matter, neurons and synapses and electrochemical gradients give rise to the apprehension of right and wrong, of obligation, of a wrongness that feels not like a preference but like a fact about the world. The Daoist tradition has a word, de, often translated as virtue, but meaning something closer to the inner power or moral potency that flows through a person who is aligned with the Tao, the way of things. De is not constructed by the person. It flows through the person from the underlying order, The Daoist sage does not manufacture virtue through effort and rule following. The sage becomes transparent to a moral potency that was always flowing, the way a clear window does not produce light but ceases to obstruct it. This is a profoundly different picture of conscience from the one in which morality is a code imposed from outside upon a naturally amoral creature. In the Daoist picture, and in the deeper strata of every tradition we will examine, the moral sense is not an imposition but a revelation, not a set of restrictions bolted onto human nature, but the surfacing, within human nature, of an order that pervades all of nature. And the question the neuroscience cannot answer, why the flinch tracks anything real, why the recoil corresponds to genuine wrongness rather than mere arbitrary aversion, is precisely the question the traditions answered by saying that conscience is the individual's contact point with an order that is larger than the individual. Hold that phrase, an order larger than the individual, because this is where the investigation is going, and the first part of the journey must end by pointing toward it. The neuroscience of conscience, taken on its own terms, describes a remarkable biological system. Fast, automatic, embodied, universal across the species, operating beneath and ahead of conscious thought. That much is fact. But the traditions, examining the same phenomenon from the inside, made a further claim that this inner system is not self-contained, that the moral sense within the person is the perception of a moral structure within reality itself, that conscience is woven into something. The Hindu word for that something is the word that fuses, in a single term, the moral order and the cosmic order, refusing to separate them. The Greek Stoics called it the logos, the rational principle that orders the cosmos and that speaks within the human breast as the voice of conscience. The Christian tradition called it the law written on the heart, an inscription whose author is the same as the author of the physical world. In every case, the claim is the same, and the claim is radical, that the wrongness you feel when you watch the wallet lifted is not a private event occurring only in your skull, but a perception, however dim, of the way reality actually is. That claim cannot be established by neuroscience. Neuroscience can take us to the edge, to the fast, embodied, universal, pre-rational moral sense, whose existence is no longer in doubt. But the question of whether that sense perceives something real, something woven into the structure of the world rather than merely projected onto it by an evolved and fallible brain, is a question that requires us to look beyond the brain entirely to the physics of information, to the strange status of mathematical and moral truth, to the question of whether the order we find within ourselves has any counterpart in the order that physics finds in the cosmos. That is where the investigation turns next. For now, sit with the fact itself, the established and remarkable fact, which is this: you knew it was wrong before you could explain why. The flinch arrived ahead of the argument. Something in you, faster and deeper than your reasoning mind, rendered a verdict on the moral quality of an act, and that something has been examined, named and revered by every tradition of human wisdom that ever turned its attention inward, long before the first electrode was ever placed against the first scalp. The conscience is older than the science of conscience. It was known before it was measured. It was revered before it was located. And it may be older, the traditions insist, than the human race itself, as old as the order it perceives, as old as the structure of the world it dimly reads. You felt it before you could explain it. You will feel it again today, the next time you watch something that should not be done. And when you do, you will be touching, with a faculty faster than thought, the question this entire investigation exists to ask, whether that touch reaches anything real. The flinch is older than your reasons, and it may be older than your species. Consider what that sentence demands. The recoil you feel when you watch cruelty done, the immediate certainty that something ought not to be happening, did not begin with you. It did not begin with your culture. It runs backward through every human society that ever existed, and then further back still, into the bodies of creatures who could not speak, who had no commandments, who never heard a sermon or read a law, and who nonetheless drew back from certain acts and reached toward others with the unmistakable rudiments of what we call conscience. A chimpanzee consoles a defeated rival. A capuchin monkey, offered a worse reward than its neighbour for the same task, hurls the cucumber back at the experimenter in what looks unmistakably like outrage at unfairness. An elephant refuses to abandon a dying member of its herd. The flinch has a history, and the history is written in flesh and blood across millions of years. And the question that opens this stage of the investigation is the deepest question conscience poses. Where did it come from? And does its origin tell us whether it is true? The question matters because origins are supposed to explain things, and the explanation cuts in two directions at once. If conscience can be fully accounted for as a product of blind evolutionary forces, if the recoil from cruelty is nothing but a behavioral adaptation that helped our ancestors cooperate, then it would seem to be, at bottom, a trick, a feeling that points at no truth, installed in us because it worked, not because it was right. But if conscience, even granting its evolutionary history, turns out to track something real the way the eye, for all its evolutionary history, tracks real light, then its origin in natural selection would be no more debunking than the eye's origin debunks sight. Everything hangs on this distinction, and the distinction cannot be resolved by studying the flinch alone. It requires us to ask what kind of universe could contain a moral truth for the flinch to track, and that is a question that leads, by a path few would expect, directly into the foundations of physics. There is a powerful answer, and it must be stated in its full strength before its limits can be seen, because the temptation in an investigation like this is to weaken the strongest opposing case in order to make one's own conclusion easier. We will not do that. The strongest answer to where conscience came from is the evolutionary answer, and it is formidable. Frans de Waal, working at Emory University across 4 decades, assembled the most complete picture ever made of the moral emotions in non-human animals, and the picture is overwhelming. The building blocks of human morality, empathy, consolation, reciprocity, a sense of fairness, the punishment of cheaters, the reconciliation of broken relationships are not human inventions. They are present in recognizable form in our primate relatives and in many other social mammals. De Waal documented chimpanzees who share food with those who have groomed them, who console the victims of aggression, who show what can only be called moral indignation when reciprocity is violated. The moral sense did not descend from the sky onto a previously amoral animal. It grew, organ by organ, capacity by capacity, out of the social life of creatures for whom cooperation was the path to survival. The mathematics of why this happened is precise, and it is one of the genuine triumphs of 20th century biology. William Hamilton, the British evolutionary biologist, published in 1964 The Theory of Inclusive Fitness, demonstrating that natural selection can favour self-sacrificing behaviour toward genetic relatives, because relatives carry copies of the same genes that an organism can propagate its own genetic material by helping kin, even at cost to itself. Robert Trivers, at Harvard in 1971, extended the logic to unrelated individuals with the theory of reciprocal altruism, showing that cooperation can be evolutionarily stable when individuals interact repeatedly and can remember who cooperated and who cheated. Out of these two mechanisms, kin selection and reciprocal altruism, a vast edifice of moral psychology can be constructed. Gratitude rewards the cooperator. Guilt repairs the relationship the cheater has damaged. Indignation punishes the betrayer. Shame anticipates the group's judgment. Each moral emotion can be read as a piece of evolved machinery, finely shaped by selection to make our ancestors better partners in the cooperative enterprise that made human survival possible. the Buddhist tradition speaks of karuna, compassion, as a fundamental orientation of an awakened mind. The evolutionary biologist locates the seed of that compassion in the mammalian care for offspring, extended outward across the widening circles of kin and ally and tribe. The two accounts are not obviously enemies. The capacity the tradition reveres, the biologist explains. The flinch was built, says the biologist, by the long pressure of selection on creatures who lived or died by their bonds. The experiments that ground this are vivid and have been replicated many times. In one of de Waal's best-known studies, conducted with Sarah Brosnan, capuchin monkeys were trained to exchange a token for a reward. When two monkeys performed the same task side by side, but one received a prized grape while the other received only a cucumber slice, the monkey given the inferior reward frequently refused to participate further, sometimes flinging the cucumber back at the experimenter in evident agitation. The sense of unfairness, the recognition that an equal contribution deserves an equal return, is not a sophisticated cultural idea layered onto human society by philosophers. It is present in a small New World monkey, firing automatically, expressed in indignation, before any reasoning could possibly occur. In other studies, chimpanzees have been observed to console victims of aggression with embraces and grooming, to remember and reciprocate past favors, and to show measurable distress at the suffering of others. These are the raw materials of conscience, and they were in place long before there were humans to philosophize about them. When the Jain tradition of India placed ahimsa, non-harm, at the center of its entire moral vision, declaring that every living being recoils from injury, and that this universal recoil is the foundation of all right action. It was articulating as a spiritual principle what de Waal would document as a biological fact, that the aversion to suffering, one's own and others, runs through the living world far below the level of human reason. And now the limit, because for all its power, the evolutionary account answers one question while leaving another untouched, and the untouched question is the one that matters most. The evolutionary account explains why we have moral feelings. It explains the existence of the machinery, the guilt, the indignation, the sense of fairness, the recoil from harm. What it does not explain, what it cannot in principle explain, is whether those feelings are true. There is a difference, and the difference is the hinge on which this entire investigation turns. When you watch the wallet lifted from the bag and you feel that it is wrong, you are not merely experiencing an evolved aversion the way you might experience an evolved taste for sugar. You are making, or you take yourself to be making, a claim about reality that the act is wrong, genuinely wrong, wrong in a way that would remain wrong even if everyone approved of it, even if it benefited you, even if natural selection had disposed you to applaud it. The flinch presents itself not as a preference, but as a perception. And the evolutionary account, which explains the preference perfectly, says nothing at all about whether the perception perceives anything. This is the oldest problem in moral philosophy, and David Hume named its sharpest edge in 1739. Hume observed that writers on morality proceed comfortably making factual observations about the world. This is the case, that is the case, and then, without warning or justification, shift into claims about what ought to be the case. But how, Hume asked, does one derive an ought from an is? How does any quantity of facts about what is, about what evolved, about what brains do, about what creatures feel ever yield a conclusion about what should be? The is-ought gap, as it came to be called, is unbridgeable by any purely factual account, and the evolutionary story is a purely factual account. It tells us, with great precision, what is, that we evolved these feelings, that they served these functions, that they are wired into these circuits. It cannot tell us what ought to be, because no description of how a feeling came to exist can establish that the feeling tracks a truth. You can give a complete causal history of why a person believes that cruelty is wrong, and you will not have shown either that they are right or that they are wrong. The history of the belief is silent on the truth of the belief, and conscience presents itself insistently as a faculty that registers truth. The problem has a second edge, sharpened by the philosopher G. E. Moore at Cambridge in 1903. Moore argued that any attempt to define goodness in terms of some natural property, to say that good simply means pleasant or conducive to survival, or whatever evolution favored, always leaves an open question. Of any natural property you might propose, it remains meaningful to ask, but is that property actually good? The fact that we can always sensibly ask the question shows, Moore contended, that goodness is not identical to any natural fact, that it is a further thing, not captured by any description of how the world physically is. This open question argument tightens the vice. The evolutionary biologist says, morality is the set of dispositions that enhance reproductive success. And conscience replies, immediately and irresistibly, but is enhancing reproductive success actually good? The question makes perfect sense. We can imagine evolved dispositions that are monstrous dispositions toward infanticide, toward the slaughter of rivals, toward deception, and we do not regard them as good merely because they were selected. We judge them. By what? By a standard that the evolutionary account does not supply, a standard the conscience seems to read off some source other than the genome. We judge them, and we do not hesitate, and the judgment feels not like a preference but like a recognition of fact. The flinch judges evolution itself, and a faculty that can stand in judgment over the very process that produced it is a strange faculty indeed. Some philosophers have drawn from this a radical conclusion. If our moral feelings are fully explained as evolved adaptations shaped to promote survival and reproduction, then perhaps there is no moral truth for them to track at all. Perhaps morality is an illusion, a useful fiction that selection installed in us, because creatures who believed in right and wrong cooperated more effectively than creatures who did not. On this view, the flinch is real as a psychological event, but empty as a perception. It points at nothing. The conviction that cruelty is genuinely wrong is a trick the genes play to keep the social machine running. This is the evolutionary debunking argument, and it is serious, and it cannot be answered by simply insisting that morality feels real. Of course, it feels real. The debunking argument predicts that it would feel real. The feeling is exactly what selection would have built, whether or not anything corresponds to it. But the debunking argument carries a cost that its proponents do not always acknowledge, and the cost is total. If evolutionary explanation dissolves the authority of moral intuition, it does not stop at morality. The same selective pressures that shaped our moral faculties shaped our reasoning faculties, our perceptual faculties, our capacity for mathematics and logic and science itself. If the fact that a faculty evolved to aid survival undermines its claim to track truth, then our confidence in logic is undermined. Our confidence in perception is undermined. Our confidence in the very reasoning by which the debunking argument was constructed is undermined. The acid that dissolves conscience dissolves everything, including the hand that poured it. This is not a marginal worry but a structural one, and several philosophers have pressed it to its conclusion. If the contents of our minds were shaped by selection solely for their survival value and not for their truth, then every product of the mind falls under the same shadow, including the scientific theories, the logical inferences, and the evolutionary argument itself, all of which are products of the same evolved cognitive apparatus. The person who uses evolution to debunk conscience is soaring through the branch on which they sit, because the reasoning that constructs the debunking argument is itself a product of the evolved brain, whose deliverance is the argument declares untrustworthy. There is no stable place to stand from which to debunk morality without also debunking the reasoning that does the debunking. And this suggests that the premise was wrong from the start, that having an evolutionary origin does not, in fact, sever a faculty from truth, and that the moral sense, like the perceptual and rational senses, may have been shaped by selection precisely because it latches onto something real. And so the thoughtful response is not to accept the debunking selectively, but to ask whether its premise is right at all, whether the fact that a faculty has an evolutionary history really does sever it from truth. We do not think this about vision. The eye evolved to aid survival, and yet we trust that it tracks real features of the world, real edges and surfaces and motions, because tracking them was how it aided survival. Why should the moral sense be different? Perhaps the moral sense aids survival, precisely because it tracks something real, a real structure of how conscious beings ought to treat one another, as real in its domain as the edges and surfaces are in theirs. The Hindu tradition would say that this is exactly the situation, that dharma, the moral order, is as woven into the fabric of reality as the physical laws, and that the moral sense evolved to perceive it the way the eye evolved to perceive light, because in both cases there was something there to be perceived. There is a further strangeness in the moral sense that deepens the mystery, and it concerns not where conscience came from, but what kind of knowing it is. Mathematical insight has a peculiar character that Roger Penrose, the mathematical physicist at Oxford who shared the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics, has spent much of his career analysing. Penrose argues, drawing on the incompleteness theorems of Kurt Gödel, that human mathematical understanding cannot be fully captured by any algorithm, that when a mathematician grasps the truth of a statement that no formal system can prove, the mathematician is doing something that no mechanical procedure, no computation, no rule following can replicate. The grasp of mathematical truth, Penrose contends, is non-algorithmic. It reaches the truth directly, in a way that exceeds calculation. And whatever one makes of Penrose's argument in its mathematical form, there is a striking parallel in the moral domain. Moral insight, too, has a non-algorithmic character. The person caught in moral dumbfounding who knows the act is wrong, but cannot derive the wrongness from any rule, is in the position of someone who sees a truth that no algorithm delivers. The conviction is not the output of a calculation, it is a direct apprehension, immediate and certain, of something the calculating mind cannot reconstruct. The flinch knows what no rule can prove. The depth of this point becomes clear when you try to build a moral machine. Engineers attempting to give artificial systems moral judgment have run repeatedly into the same wall. You can specify rules do not harm, tell the truth, keep promises, but the rules immediately collide. Telling the truth can harm. Keeping a promise can require a lie. And resolving the collision requires a judgment about which consideration matters more in this particular case. A judgment that is not contained in any of the rules and cannot be derived from them by any mechanical procedure. The human being makes this judgment effortlessly, through a direct moral perception of the situation as a whole, weighing imponderables that no algorithm can enumerate. This is the non-algorithmic character of conscience made operational. The moral sense does something that rule-following cannot reproduce, something that looks less like computation and more like sight. The Hindu concept of viveka, discriminative wisdom, names exactly this faculty, the refined perception that distinguishes the real from the unreal, the right from the wrong, not by applying a formula, but by a clarity of seeing that the formula could never capture. And the Confucian tradition, which built one of history's most sophisticated ethical systems, ultimately located moral excellence not in the mastery of rules, but in the cultivation of a perceptive sensibility, the capacity of the exemplary person to perceive what each unique situation requires. Both traditions converge on the recognition that the deepest moral knowing is a kind of perception, and perception, unlike calculation, implies a reality that is perceived. This non-algorithmic character is why conscience has always resisted reduction to a code. Every attempt to capture morality in a finite set of rules has foundered on the same rock. The rules require judgment to apply, and the judgment is not itself a rule. You can write the commandment, but knowing when it applies, how it bends, where the genuine exception lies, this requires a moral perception that the commandment cannot contain. The Daoist tradition understood this with particular clarity. The Tao Te Ching opens with the warning that the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, that the deepest order cannot be captured in words and rules, that it must be perceived directly by one who has become attuned to it. The Taoist sage governs by Wu Wei, by a kind of effortless action that flows from alignment with the way of things, rather than from the mechanical application of precepts. This is moral knowing, as direct perception rather than rule following, exactly the non-algorithmic apprehension that conscience displays and that the science of moral intuition keeps rediscovering. The flinch is not a look-up in a table, it is a seeing, and a seeing implies something seen. We are being drawn, step by step, toward a question that physics will have to address, and the bridge is the concept of information. When you perceive that an act is wrong, what is the status of the thing you perceive? It is not a material object. You cannot weigh wrongness or measure its temperature, and yet the wrongness is not nothing, it makes a difference. It constrains action. It is registered by the brain and felt in the body and acted upon in the world. The philosopher confronts here the same puzzle that the physicist confronts with the laws of nature themselves. The law of gravitation is not a material object either. You cannot weigh it, and yet it is not nothing. It governs the falling of every stone and the orbit of every world. The laws of physics have a strange status. They are not made of matter, and yet matter obeys them. They are, in some sense, the philosophy of physics has never fully resolved, more like information than like substance, abstract structures to which the concrete world conforms. And the question this raises for conscience is electric. If the physical world is governed by an order that is not itself physical, an order more like mathematics than like matter, then is it so strange to suppose that there might also be a moral order of the same abstract kind, a structure of how conscious beings ought to act, to which the moral sense conforms the way matter conforms to law? The comparison is not idle wordplay. It points to one of the genuine mysteries at the foundation of physics. The physicist Eugene Wigner, who shared the 1963 Nobel Prize, wrote a famous essay in 1960 on what he called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences, the astonishing and unexplained fact that abstract mathematical structures, often developed by pure mathematicians with no thought of application, turn out again and again to describe the physical world with uncanny precision. Why should the universe be written in the language of mathematics? Why should reality conform to abstract structures that are not themselves physical? Wigner called it a miracle that we neither understand nor deserve. And the mystery deepens when one considers that mathematical truths appear to be discovered rather than invented, that the mathematician exploring the properties of numbers feels like an explorer mapping a territory that was already there, not an architect building a structure from nothing. Mathematical reality has the strange status of being abstract, non-physical, and yet objectively real, perceived by the mind rather than constructed by it. And if reality includes a realm of objective abstract truth that the mind perceives the mathematical realm, then the suggestion that it might also include a realm of objective moral truth, perceived by the conscience, the way mathematical truth is perceived by the reason, becomes far less strange. The Platonic tradition, which stands behind so much of both Western mathematics and Western ethics, held precisely this, that there is a realm of eternal forms, including the form of the good, and that the soul at its highest perceives these realities directly. Whether or not one accepts the full Platonic metaphysics, the structure of the proposal is coherent, and it dovetails with the way both mathematical and moral knowing actually feel from the inside, as discovery, not invention, as perception, not construction. This is the threshold the investigation has now reached, and it is worth marking clearly what is established and what is speculative, because the discipline of distinguishing the two is what separates this inquiry from the wishful thinking it refuses to become. What is established is this: the moral sense is real, ancient, embodied, universal, and non-algorithmic. It presents itself as a perception of truth rather than a mere preference, and the evolutionary account of its origin, however powerful, does not by itself determine whether the truth it claims to perceive exists. What is speculative, and it must be labelled speculative, held as a question rather than asserted as a fact, is the further proposal toward which the traditions point, that the moral order the conscience dimly reads is woven into the structure of reality itself, as objective in its own domain as the physical laws are in theirs, and that the flinch is the perception within the human person of something that does not belong to the human person but to the cosmos. That proposal cannot be established by the science of conscience. It requires us to leave the brain and turn to the world to ask whether the order physics finds in the cosmos has room in it for an order of value, whether the information that physicists increasingly regard as the bedrock of reality could include moral information, whether the universe that produced beings who flinch at cruelty is the kind of universe in which cruelty is, in some objective sense, actually wrong. The traditions did not hesitate at this threshold. They walked across it. The Stoic philosophers of the ancient Mediterranean held that the cosmos is pervaded by logos, a rational ordering principle, and that the human capacity for reason and conscience is a fragment of that cosmic logos seated within the individual. To live rightly, for the Stoic, was to bring one's own reason into alignment with the reason that governs the whole, to recognize that the moral law within and the natural law without are expressions of a single order. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor writing his private meditations in the 2nd century, returned again and again to this conviction, that there is a universal nature, that the rational soul participates in it, and that the voice of conscience is the voice of that universal nature speaking within. The Stoic Cleanthes, in his hymn to Zeus, addressed the cosmic ordering principle as the source of a universal law that governs all things, and that the wise bring their lives into accord with. The moral law and the law of the cosmos were, for the Stoics, two faces of one logos. This was not poetry decorating a scientific worldview. For the Stoics, it was the scientific worldview, a thoroughgoing conviction that the rational structure governing the stars and the rational structure governing the conscience were the same structure, and that to be moral was to be in tune with the rationality of the whole. The Christian tradition absorbed this insight and deepened it. The natural law tradition, articulated by Aquinas and rooted in the Apostle Paul's claim that the law is written on the hearts even of those who never received it, holds that the moral order is grounded in the very nature of things as created, that conscience is the human participation in an eternal law that is the mind of the source itself. These are not vague mystical gestures. They are precise philosophical claims that the moral order is objective, that it is woven into the structure of reality, and that conscience is the faculty by which the individual perceives it. The science of conscience has independently established that the faculty exists, and that it operates exactly as a perceptual faculty would. Whether what it perceives is real is the question that remains, and it is a question that physics, not neuroscience, must now help us approach. So the flinch leads us outward. It began as a feeling in the body, a recoil faster than thought, and we have followed it down into the brain and back across the evolutionary history of life, and at every stage it has presented us with the same insistent claim and the same unanswered question. The claim that something is genuinely wrong, that the perception reaches a truth. The question whether the truth is there. Evolution explains the feeling and is silent on the truth. Neuroscience locates the perception and cannot certify what it perceives. Philosophy sharpens the question to its finest point and hands it on. And the question, sharpened, is this: is the moral order real, objective, woven into the structure of the world, or is it a shadow cast by an evolved and lonely brain onto a cosmos that contains no values at all, only particles and forces indifferent to the difference between kindness and cruelty? This is not a question that can be settled by feeling, however strong. It is a question about the nature of reality, and to approach it, we must turn to the discipline that has gone furthest into the nature of reality, the discipline that has discovered that the world is stranger than matter, that information may be more fundamental than substance, that the cosmos is governed by an order that is not itself made of anything. We must ask what physics has found at the bottom of the world, and whether there is room in that strange foundation for the wrongness you felt when you watched the wallet lifted from the bag. Consider how much rests on the answer. If the moral order is real, woven into the structure of things, as objective as the laws that hold the atoms together, then every flinch you have ever felt was a contact, however faint, with the deepest reality there is. And the universe is not the value-free machine that one picture of science describes, but a cosmos shot through with an order of obligation as fundamental as the order of physics. And if the moral order is not real, if the flinch points at nothing, if cruelty and kindness are merely different arrangements of indifferent particles, then conscience is the most poignant illusion our species carries, a feeling of meaning in a universe that contains none. Between these two possibilities there is no middle ground, and the choice between them is not a matter of taste. It is a matter of what is actually the case about the world. The flinch has brought us to the edge of physics. What waits on the other side is the question of whether conscience touches the structure of the cosmos itself, whether the wrongness you felt is a fact about reality or a fiction about your genes. And to learn which, we must go down, past the brain that registers the flinch and the evolution that built it, into the foundation of the world itself, where physics has found that reality is made not of solid stuff but of something far closer to law, to information, to order, and where the question of whether that order has a moral dimension is no longer a question that can be dismissed. The wrongness you felt weighs nothing, and yet it is not nothing. Hold that paradox, because it is the doorway into the strangest territory this investigation will enter. When you watched the wallet lifted from the bag and the flinch fired, something was registered, a wrongness, a violation, a fact about how things ought not to be. You cannot weigh that wrongness. You cannot measure its temperature, or locate its position, or capture it in a jar. By every test that physics applies to matter, the wrongness is nothing at all, and yet it changed the world. It changed your face, your heartbeat, your next action. It has changed the course of history, wherever conscience moved a person to act. Something that is not made of matter reached into the world of matter and moved it. And this, it turns out, is not a unique embarrassment of ethics. It is the central mystery of physics itself, because the laws that govern every atom in the universe have exactly the same impossible status. They weigh nothing. They are made of nothing, and yet all of matter bends to obey them. Think carefully about the law of gravitation. It is not a thing. You cannot find it anywhere in space. It is not located in the apple, or in the earth, or in the gap between them. It has no mass, no charge, no temperature, no position. By every criterion physics uses to identify the real furniture of the world, the law of gravity is as immaterial as the wrongness of theft. And yet no physicist doubts that it is real, that it is objective, that it governs the cosmos whether or not anyone believes in it. The law is a structure, an abstract pattern to which concrete matter conforms. And if reality already contains immaterial structures that are nonetheless perfectly real and perfectly binding the laws of physics, the truths of mathematics, then the existence of one more kind of immaterial yet real structure, a moral order to which conscience responds, is not the violation of physics it might first appear. It is one more instance of the very thing physics already takes for granted, that the deepest realities are not made of stuff. This is the discovery that physics made as it descended toward the foundation of reality, and it overturns the picture most people still carry of what the physical world is. The common picture is materialist in the old sense. Reality is made of stuff, little bits of matter, tiny solid objects bouncing around in empty space, and everything else, mind, value, meaning. Conscience is either made of that stuff or is an illusion floating above it. But this is not what physics found when it looked. It found that the little solid objects are not solid and may not be objects. It found that matter dissolves as you descend into fields, into probabilities, into excitations of underlying structures that are described not by saying what they are made of, but by writing down the mathematical laws they obey. At the bottom of the physical world, physics did not find stuff. It found law. It found structure. It found something far more like information than like the solid matter the materialist imagined. And the moment you grasp that the physical world is, at its foundation, an informational and law-governed structure rather than a heap of inert stuff, the question of whether that structure could include a moral dimension stops being absurd and becomes a question worth asking with care. Begin with information, because information is the concept that has migrated over the last half-century from the engineering of communication into the foundation of physics itself. In 1961, Rolf Landauer, a physicist at IBM, proved a result whose implications are still being absorbed. Landauer's principle states that erasing a single bit of information has an unavoidable physical cost. It must dissipate a minimum quantity of heat, a precise amount set by the temperature, and a fundamental constant of nature. The significance is profound. It means that information is not an abstraction floating free of the physical world. Information is physical. To manipulate it is to do thermodynamic work. To erase it is to pay a thermodynamic price. Information and energy are bound together at the deepest level, and the bridge between them is exact and measurable. The bit is as real, as physical, as the erg and the gram. The depth of this binding became vivid through a puzzle that had haunted physics for nearly a century, the paradox of Maxwell's demon. James Clerk Maxwell had imagined, in 1867, a tiny intelligent being who could sort fast and slow molecules, apparently creating order from disorder and violating the second law of thermodynamics. For generations the demon resisted exorcism. It was Landauer's principle, applied by his IBM colleague Charles Bennett, that finally laid the demon to rest. The demon must store information about the molecules to sort them, and when it eventually erases that information to continue operating, the erasure dissipates exactly enough heat to preserve the second law. Information was the missing term in the accounting of the physical universe. The books did not balance until information was entered as a physical quantity on the ledger, and the implications reached to the largest scales. The physicist Jacob Bekenstein, working in the 1970s, discovered that the information content of any region of space is bounded by the area of its surface, and that black holes carry entropy disorder, missing information proportional to the area of their event horizons. Information, it emerged, is not merely physical. It may be the currency in which the deepest accounts of the universe are written, more fundamental than the matter whose behavior it tracks. And once information is established as a physical quantity, the boundary between the abstract and the concrete, between the world of meaning and the world of matter, begins to dissolve in a way that has consequences far beyond engineering. John Archibald Wheeler, the Princeton physicist who had stood at the center of 20th century physics, drew the radical conclusion and compressed it into a phrase that has become famous: it from bit. Wheeler proposed that information is not one feature of the physical world among others, but its very foundation, that every it, every particle, every field, every force derives its existence from bits, from binary answers to yes or no questions, from acts of information. Reality, on Wheeler's view, is at bottom informational. The material world precipitates out of a substrate of information, the way a pattern precipitates out of a code. This remains a speculative and contested vision. It must be labelled as such, for it is not established physics but a philosophical interpretation that some physicists embrace and others reject. But it is taken seriously at the highest levels of the discipline, and it points toward a picture of reality in which the old opposition between matter and meaning has broken down. If the foundation of the world is information rather than stuff, then a world that contains beings who perceive meaning, who register value, who flinch at wrongness, is not an absurdity requiring those beings to be explained away. It is, perhaps, an expression of a foundation that was informational, structured, and meaning-laden from the start. The Vedantic tradition of India asserted, millennia before Landauer or Wheeler, that the ground of reality is chit consciousness, awareness, knowing woven together with being and bliss in the formula Sat Chit Ananda, that which is, that which knows, that which is blessed. The claim that knowing is fundamental to reality, that the bottom of the world is not blind stuff but something more like awareness, is the oldest claim of that tradition. And physics, having descended to the foundation, has found there not stuff but structure, not matter but information, not the blind machinery the materialist expected, but a law-governed order that bears, at minimum, a structural resemblance to mind. Wheeler took the implication further still into what he called the participatory universe, the proposal that observation is not a passive registering of a pre-existing reality, but a constitutive act, that observers participate in bringing the observed world into definite being. He summarized the strangeness in another compressed phrase: no phenomenon is a real phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. Whatever one finally makes of this, and it remains, like it from bit, a contested interpretation rather than settled physics, it places mind, observation, knowing, at the very heart of what reality is, rather than at its periphery as a late and accidental byproduct. And this is precisely the reversal that the contemplative traditions had always urged. The materialist picture places mind at the end of a long causal chain, first the particles, then the chemistry, then the biology, then, at last, and almost as an afterthought, consciousness flickering into being in a few warm, wet brains. The Vedantic picture reverses the order. Consciousness is not the last thing but the first thing, not the product of reality but its ground. Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, bliss names a foundation in which awareness is not derived from anything more basic, because there is nothing more basic than awareness. When Wheeler places observation at the foundation of physics, he is not proving Vedanta. He is, however, arriving by the path of physics at a structural position that Vedanta reached by the path of contemplation, and the convergence of those two utterly different paths on a single strange conclusion is the kind of thing that ought to make a careful thinker sit up. Now turn to the order itself, to the laws, because the laws raise a question that bears directly on whether the cosmos could have a moral dimension. The laws of physics, it turns out, are exquisitely fine-tuned. The fundamental constants of nature, the strength of gravity, the strength of the nuclear forces, the mass of the electron, the cosmological constant that governs the expansion of space have values that fall within extraordinarily narrow ranges, and had they fallen outside those ranges, the universe would have been sterile. Alter the strength of the strong nuclear force by a few percent, and stars cannot forge the carbon on which life depends. Alter the cosmological constant by a fantastically small fraction, and the universe either flies apart before galaxies can form or collapses before it begins. The physicist Fred Hoyle, calculating in the 1950s the precise nuclear resonance required for stars to produce carbon, was so struck by the precision that he wrote that the universe looked like a put-up job, as though a super-intellect had monkeyed with the physics. The fine-tuning of the constants is established fact, acknowledged across the discipline. What it means is fiercely contested, and we will hold the contest open honestly rather than pretending it resolves in our favour, weighing the competing readings on their merits rather than seizing whichever one happens to flatter the thesis. But the bare fact is this: the physical order of the universe is not arbitrary. It is precise, structured, and improbably hospitable to the emergence of conscious life, as though the cosmos were arranged, from its foundation, to bring forth beings who could perceive it. The catalogue of these coincidences is long and specific. The ratio of the electromagnetic force to gravity must lie within a narrow band, or stars burn too fast or too slow for life. The difference in mass between the proton and the neutron is finely poised. Shift it slightly, and either hydrogen is unstable or no heavy elements form. The strength of the strong force that binds atomic nuclei sits at a value that permits both the existence of the deuteron, without which stars could not begin fusion, and the resonance Hoyle identified that allows carbon to form. Above all, the cosmological constant, the energy of empty space that drives the expansion of the universe, has a value smaller than naive theory predicts, by something like 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, a number so vast that no analogy can convey it. And yet, if it were larger by even a tiny fraction, no structure could ever have formed at all. These are not vague impressions. They are quantitative facts about the constants of nature, and they cluster, with a consistency that has impressed even the most skeptical physicists, around the narrow values that permit a universe of stars and chemistry and life. Honesty requires acknowledging the leading naturalistic response, which is the multiverse. If there exist vast numbers of universes, each with different constants, then we should not be surprised to find ourselves in one of the rare life-permitting ones, since only such a universe could contain observers to find anything at all. This is a serious proposal, taken seriously by serious physicists, and it cannot be dismissed. But it is worth noting two things about it. First, it is not established. The other universes are, by their nature, unobservable, and the multiverse remains a theoretical inference rather than a measured fact. Second, even if granted, it does not so much remove the order as relocate it, for the multiverse-generating mechanism must itself be finely structured to produce universes at all. The fine-tuning may be pushed back a level, but the deep fact that reality is the kind of thing that is precisely ordered and capable of producing mind is not thereby made to vanish. The investigation does not rest its case on fine-tuning. It notes only that the physical order is precise rather than arbitrary, and that a precisely ordered, mind-producing cosmos is a more plausible home for an objective moral order than the random, indifferent chaos the old materialism imagined. The relevance to conscience is structural, and it must be drawn carefully. The fine-tuning argument concerns the physical order, the constants that permit stars and chemistry and life. It does not, by itself, establish a moral order, but it establishes something that makes the moral order easier to contemplate, that the universe is the kind of thing that has an order woven into it from the foundation, an order that is precise rather than arbitrary, an order oriented, in some sense that remains mysterious, toward the emergence of mind. And once you accept that the physical structure of reality is fine-tuned, precise, and oriented toward consciousness, the further suggestion that this same reality might contain a moral structure, an order of how the conscious beings it produces ought to live, ceases to be a wild leap and becomes a natural extension of the same insight. The Hindu tradition has a single word that fuses these two orders and refuses to separate them, and that word stands at the very center of this investigation, rita, the cosmic order from which dharma, the moral order, is inseparable. The Vedic sages did not believe in two orders, one physical and one moral, accidentally coexisting. They believed in one order, rita, that governs the turning of the seasons and the rising of the sun, and equally governs the right conduct of human life, because the cosmos and the conscience are expressions of a single underlying structure. When physics discovers that the cosmos is fine-tuned, precisely ordered, and hospitable to mind, it is uncovering, in the domain of physical law, the kind of order that the Vedic tradition insisted was also moral. And the Vedic tradition was not alone in fusing the cosmic and the moral into a single order. The conviction appears, independently, across the great civilizations, which is itself a remarkable fact. The ancient Egyptians spoke of Ma'at, the principle of truth, justice, and cosmic order, all at once the order by which the sun rose, the Nile flooded, and the human heart was to be weighed. To violate justice was to violate the order that held the cosmos together. The moral and the cosmic were one principle, personified as a goddess and represented by a feather against which the heart of the dead was measured. The Chinese tradition spoke of Tian, heaven, as the source of a moral order that pervades the cosmos, and of the mandate of heaven that legitimated right rule and withdrew from the unjust. The moral order and the natural order flowed from a single heaven. That cultures with no contact between them, Vedic India, Pharaonic Egypt, ancient China independently arrived at the conviction that the moral order and the cosmic order are one is not proof that they were right. But it is the kind of convergence that demands explanation, and the simplest explanation is the one the traditions themselves offered, that they were all perceiving, through the faculty of conscience, the same single order that genuinely structures reality, the order that physics now finds, in its own domain, to be precise rather than arbitrary and hospitable to the mind that perceives it. This is a structural parallel, not a proof. But the parallel is exact, and it is ancient, and it is worth the most careful attention. There is a further feature of the quantum world that invites a connection to conscience, and here the discipline of marking the speculative becomes most important, because this is the territory where careful thought most easily slides into wishful thinking. The feature is non-locality, quantum entanglement, established beyond dispute by the experiments of Alain Aspect at the University of Paris in 1982 and honoured with the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2022, demonstrates that two particles which have once interacted remain correlated across any distance, with the measurement of one instantaneously associated with the state of the other, with no signal passing between them through space. The universe, at the quantum level, is non-separable. The deep reality is not a collection of independent things that happen to be near one another. It is a unified whole in which apparent separation is a feature of the surface rather than the foundation. This much is established physics. Now comes the speculative bridge, and it must be held as a question, an analogy, a resonance, not as a claim that quantum mechanics explains empathy. The moral life centers on a kind of non-separation. The flinch you feel at another's pain, the empathy that dissolves the boundary between your suffering and theirs, the recognition that lies at the heart of every tradition's ethics that the other is not truly other, that to harm another is in some sense to harm oneself, is a moral non-locality, a felt connection that transcends the apparent separation of distinct bodies. The Hindu formula Tat Tvam Asi, you are that. The Buddhist insight into the interdependence of all beings. The Christian teaching that we are members of one body all assert that beneath the surface of separate selves lies a deeper unity, and that morality is the acknowledgement of that unity, is the moral non-separation that grounds empathy connected, in any deep way, to the physical non-separation that grounds entanglement? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that no current physics establishes such a connection. To claim that entangled particles explain compassion, or that empathy is literally quantum entanglement between brains, would be exactly the kind of overreach. This channel refuses a misuse of physics to dress up a spiritual intuition in borrowed authority. There is no evidence for such a mechanism, and the timescales and conditions of quantum entanglement do not survive in the warm, wet, noisy environment of the brain in any way that could underwrite empathy. So the bridge is not mechanical, but it may be structural, and a structural resonance is not nothing. The deepest physics and the deepest ethics both describe a reality in which separation is not the final truth, in which the apparent independence of distinct things gives way, at a deeper level, to connection, to unity, to a whole that the parts only seem to fragment. Physics found this unity at the bottom of matter. The traditions found it at the bottom of the moral life. Whether these are two glimpses of one underlying fact, or merely two domains that happen to share a structure, is a question that no one can currently answer. But it is a question worth holding open, with the speculative clearly marked as speculative, because the convergence is real even if its meaning is unknown. It is worth pausing on why the discipline of marking matters so much here. This channel exists in a landscape crowded with claims that quantum mechanics proves this or that. Spiritual doctrine that entanglement explains telepathy, that observation manifests your desires, that the vacuum is a cosmic mind awaiting your instructions. These claims are false, and they are false in a specific and instructive way. They take a real and astonishing feature of physics and graft onto it a mechanism that the physics does not support, borrowing the authority of the equations to license a leap. The equations forbid. The non-separability of the quantum world is real. The non-separability of the moral world, the deep truth that to harm another is to harm oneself is, the traditions insist, also real. But to say that the first causes or explains the second is to commit exactly the error this investigation refuses. What can be said, and said with care, is that two of the deepest inquiries the human mind has ever undertaken, the physics of the very small and the ethics of the moral life, both arrived, by completely independent routes, at the discovery that separation is not the final truth about reality. That is a convergence of conclusions, not a chain of causation. And a convergence of conclusions, honestly labelled, is a thing worth contemplating without pretending it is more than it is. There is one more piece of physics that bears on conscience, and it concerns whether something non-physical, a meaning, a value, a moral truth could possibly make a difference in a world governed by physical law. The old worry was that physics is causally closed, that every physical event is fully determined by prior physical events, leaving no room for meaning or value to push anything around, rendering conscience, at best a spectator, and at worst an illusion. But two developments have softened this picture. The first is quantum indeterminacy. At the quantum level, the future is not fully determined by the past. The equations yield probabilities, not certainties, and the actualization of one outcome rather than another is not fixed by prior physical conditions. This does not prove that conscience reaches into the quantum world to tip the balance. That would be another overreach, but it dissolves the old certainty that physics leaves no room for anything but mechanism. The world has genuine openness in it. The second development is the recognition, across many sciences, of what is called downward causation, the way higher-level patterns and structures constrain and shape the behavior of their lower-level components. The pattern of a whirlpool governs the motion of its water molecules. The meaning of a sentence governs the arrangement of its ink. Wholes shape parts, not only parts wholes. The water does not first decide to move and then form a whirlpool. The whirlpool, once formed, dictates where each molecule must go. The pattern has causal power over its own constituents, and the constituents obey a logic that exists only at the level of the whole. And if meaning can shape matter in the case of a sentence, then the materialist dogma that meaning is causally inert, that only the particles do real work, is at least open to question. The physicist theologians who have thought most carefully about this, John Polkinghorne at Cambridge, who left particle physics for the priesthood, and Nancy Murphy and Robert John Russell, who have spent careers on the interface of physics and theology, have argued that the openness of physical law leaves room for the action of meaning and purpose and value in the world, that the cosmos is not the closed machine the old materialism imagined, but a structure, open at every level, to the influence of higher orders, perhaps including a moral order, perhaps including the divine. The point is not to claim that this has been demonstrated. It has not, and to say otherwise would be to abandon the honesty that gives this inquiry whatever value it has. The point is narrower and sturdier. For most of the modern period, a particular picture of physics was used to rule the moral life out of reality. In advance, the picture of a closed, deterministic machine in which every event is fixed by prior physical causes, leaving no room for value to do anything, and therefore good reason to conclude that value is an illusion. That picture is no longer tenable as physics. The world is not rigidly deterministic. The quantum foundation is open. The world is not purely bottom-up. Higher-level structures genuinely constrain their parts. The world is not made of inert stuff. It is made of information, of law, of structure that shades into something like mind. None of this proves that conscience perceives a real moral order, but all of it removes the obstacle that was supposed to make such perception impossible. The door that materialism slammed shut has been, by physics itself, quietly reopened. And through the reopened door, the ancient claim of the traditions that the moral order is real, objective, woven into the structure of things walks back in, no longer as superstition to be dismissed, but as a hypothesis the new physics cannot exclude. Let us mark, with the discipline this investigation requires, exactly where we stand. What is established is remarkable enough. Information is physical, bound to energy at the foundation of reality. The material world dissolves, at the bottom, into law and structure, and something more like information than like stuff. The constants of physics are fine-tuned with extraordinary precision. The cosmic order is not arbitrary, and the universe is improbably hospitable to the emergence of mind. The quantum world is non-separable, unified beneath the appearance of separation, and genuinely open rather than rigidly determined. Higher-level patterns exert real constraint on lower-level components. All of this is physics, contested in its interpretation, but solid in its substance. What is speculative, and must be held as a question, not asserted as a finding, is the further proposal toward which these facts gesture, that woven into this informational, fine-tuned, non-separable, open order of physical reality, there is also a moral order, a structure of value as objective as the structure of law, and that conscience is the faculty by which embodied minds perceive it. Physics does not establish this. Physics cannot establish this. But physics has dismantled the worldview on which the proposal was unthinkable. The cosmos that physics has revealed is not the value-free machine of the old materialism. It is an ordered, informational, mind-hospitable, non-separable, open reality, and in such a reality the existence of a moral order is no longer absurd. It is a live possibility, and the traditions that asserted it for millennia deserve, at minimum, a hearing. So the flinch has led us all the way down, past the brain, past evolution, into the foundation of the physical world itself, and at the foundation we have found not the dead matter that would have made conscience an illusion, but an order, precise, informational, fine-tuned, unified, open, the kind of order in which a moral structure would not be out of place. We have not proven that conscience touches the cosmos. We have shown that the cosmos is the kind of thing that conscience might touch, and that is the most that physics can do, because physics studies the structure of what is, not the content of what ought to be. And the question of conscience is finally a question about the ought, about value, about the moral order that the flinch claims to perceive. To go further, we must turn from the physicists to the traditions, to the vast, patient, millennia-deep examination of conscience carried out by the Hindu sages who named the order Rita and Dharma, by the Buddhist analysts who mapped the moral law of karma, by the Christian theologians who spoke of the law written on the heart and the eternal law behind it, by the Daoist masters who pointed to the virtue that flows from alignment with the way. These traditions did not have the physics, but they had something the physics cannot provide, a direct, sustained, disciplined attention to the moral order as it is perceived from within, by the conscience that reads it. They walked, for thousands of years, the territory that physics has only now shown to be real terrain. And what they found there, when they turned the full force of human contemplative genius onto the question of what the flinch perceives, is the deepest answer our species has ever given to the question of whether conscience is woven into the structure of the world. That answer is what we turn to next. The physics has prepared the ground. The traditions will tell us what grows there. Every tradition that ever examined the flinch reached the same verdict. It is not yours. The recoil you feel at cruelty, the certainty that some things must not be done, the inner voice that judges before you reason, the contemplative traditions of the world, examining this faculty across thousands of years with a rigor that the modern mind underestimates, arrived with startling unanimity at a conclusion that the modern mind resists. The conscience is not a private possession. It is not manufactured by the individual, not installed by the culture, not generated by the brain as a liver generates bile. It is a perception. And what it perceives is an order that does not belong to the person at all, an order woven into the structure of reality itself, an order the traditions named with their deepest and most central words. The Hindu sages called it rita and dharma. The Buddhists called it the dharma and bound it to the law of karma. The Christians called it the law written on the heart and traced it to the eternal law behind all things. The Daoists called it the Tao and the virtue that flows from alignment with it. These were not poetic flourishes. They were the considered conclusions of the most sustained investigation into conscience that the human species has ever conducted, and they all point in the same direction, outward, beyond the self, to a moral order as real as the physical one. We must take these traditions seriously as bodies of evidence, not merely as collections of beliefs. For thousands of years, in monasteries and forests and academies across every continent, human beings devoted entire lives to the disciplined examination of consciousness and its moral structure, with a rigor and a sustained attention that the modern world, for all its instruments, has rarely matched in this particular domain. They were not naive. They argued, refined, tested their claims against experience, built sophisticated psychologies, and subjected the moral sense to scrutiny across generations. When such a vast and varied enterprise, conducted independently in cultures that had no contact with one another, converges on a single structural conclusion, that convergence is data. It does not prove the conclusion true, but it is exactly the pattern we would expect if the conclusion were true. If there really were a moral order woven into reality, which the human conscience is built to perceive, and which sufficiently disciplined attention would uncover wherever it was directed, the unanimity of the traditions on the deep structure, beneath their disagreements on the surface, is the fingerprint of a real object being examined from many angles. Begin with the tradition that fused the two orders most completely, because it holds the key to everything. In the oldest layer of Hindu thought, the hymns of the Rig Veda composed more than 3,000 years ago, there appears a word of immense power, rita. Rita is the cosmic order, the principle by which the universe is rightly arranged, by which the sun follows its path, the seasons turn in their sequence, the waters flow to the sea, and the moral life of human beings is rightly ordered. There is no separation in the concept of rita between the order that governs the stars and the order that governs the soul. They are one order. The same principle that keeps the cosmos from collapsing into chaos keeps the human heart from collapsing into wickedness. And to live rightly is to live in accordance with rita, in tune with the deep structure of a universe that is itself structured by truth. The guardians of rita were the gods, Varuna and Mitra, who watched over both the regularity of nature and the keeping of promises, the cosmic and the moral aspects of a single order. When a person spoke falsely or betrayed a trust, they violated not merely a social rule, but the very principle that holds reality together. This is the oldest recorded form of the claim this entire investigation has been pursuing. That conscience is woven into the structure of the cosmos, because the moral order and the cosmic order are not two things but one. The figure of Varuna repays a closer look, because in him the fusion is personified with startling clarity. Varuna is the cosmic sovereign who upholds rita, and the hymns address him simultaneously as the one who set the sun in the sky and carved the channels of the rivers, and as the one who sees every human deceit, who knows when a person has lied, who binds the guilty with his cosmic order the way a rope binds a captive. The same God governs the regularity of the heavens and the honesty of the human heart, because in the Vedic vision these are not separate jurisdictions. A lie is a tear in the same fabric that holds the stars in their courses. When a Vedic poet confessed wrongdoing and begged Varuna to loosen the bonds of guilt, he was not appealing to an arbitrary divine policeman. He was acknowledging that he had set himself against the structure of reality itself, the rita that orders all things, and seeking to be restored to alignment with it. The flinch, in this most ancient vocabulary, is the awareness that one has moved against rita, the felt registration of a misalignment, not merely with social expectation, but with the deep order of the cosmos. There could be no more direct statement of the thesis that conscience is woven into space-time than this 3,000-year-old conviction that to violate the moral order is to violate the order that holds the universe together. From rita, as Hindu thought developed across the centuries, emerged the even more central concept of dharma, a word so rich that no single English term can carry it. Dharma means law, duty, righteousness, the way things are meant to be, the order that sustains. It comes from a root meaning to hold, to support, to uphold. Dharma is what holds the world together and what holds a life together, and these are understood as the same holding. To follow one's dharma is to act in accordance with the deep order of reality, to play one's part in the cosmic structure rightly. And crucially, dharma is not invented by human beings or decreed by social convention. It is discovered, perceived, recognized by the one who sees clearly, because it is already woven into the nature of things. The Bhagavad Gita, the most beloved of Hindu scriptures, is at its heart a teaching about dharma, about the warrior Arjuna's struggle to perceive and follow his true duty in an agonizing moral situation, and about the divine teaching that right action flows from alignment with the eternal order, rather than from calculation of consequences or surrender to desire. The flinch, in the vocabulary of this tradition, is the first faint touch of dharma upon the soul, the perception, dim and immediate, of the order one is meant to uphold, The teaching of the Bhagavad Gita deepens this in a way that bears directly on the relationship between conscience and the cosmic order. Krishna instructs Arjuna that right action is action performed in accordance with dharma, but without attachment to its fruits. Action that flows from alignment with the eternal order rather than from the calculation of personal advantage. This is a profound reframing of the moral life. The person who acts rightly is not the one who computes consequences most cleverly, nor the one who follows rules most rigidly, but the one who has brought their will into accord with the deep order of things and acts from that alignment. The Gita distinguishes this from mere desire-driven action on one side and mere mechanical rule-following on the other. Right action is action in tune with dharma, perceived through a purified discernment that the tradition calls buddhi when it is clear, and viveka when it discriminates the real from the unreal. The flinch, refined and clarified through spiritual practice, becomes this discernment, the matured perception of the moral order that began as a raw recoil and develops, through cultivation, into a steady seeing of what dharma requires. Conscience is not static. It is a faculty that can be clouded by desire and ego or clarified by discipline. And at its clearest, it perceives the order of reality with a directness that no calculation could achieve, and the tradition located the faculty that perceives dharma with precision. Within the human person, the Hindu analysis identified the anterior min, the inner controller, the indwelling witness, who observes all action and knows its conformity or violation of the moral order directly. Deeper still, the tradition spoke of the Atman, the true self, which is not the chattering surface mind but the witnessing consciousness beneath it, and which is ultimately identical with Brahman, the ground of all being. The startling claim at the heart of Hindu thought, Tat Tvam Asi, you are that is that the consciousness at the core of the individual is the same as the consciousness at the core of reality. And if that is so, then conscience is not the individual peering at an external moral law. It is the universal consciousness seated within the individual, recognizing its own order. The flinch is the cosmos knowing itself through you, the deep order recognizing its own violation through the faculty it has placed within every perceiving being. This is the boldest form of the claim that conscience is woven into space-time. Not that the individual perceives an external order, but that the perceiver and the order perceived are, at the deepest level, one and the same reality. The tradition pressed this insight through the image of the witness, the sakshi, the silent awareness that observes all the contents of experience without being caught up in them, watching the thoughts and feelings and deeds pass by, like clouds across a sky that is never disturbed by them. This witnessing consciousness is, in the Advaita Vedanta analysis, articulated most powerfully by the 8th century philosopher Shankara, the true self, identical with the Absolute. And it is this witness that registers the moral quality of action with perfect immediacy, because it is not the calculating mind, but the pure awareness in which the moral order is reflected as in a clear mirror. When you feel the flinch, the tradition says, it is the witness within you that feels it the deepest layer of your consciousness, which is not finally separate from the consciousness that grounds the cosmos, recognizing a violation of the order that it itself, at the deepest level, is. There is a vertigo in this claim that is worth feeling rather than rushing past. It means that the moral sense is not a small biological alarm rattling in an indifferent universe. It is the universe, awake in you, knowing right from wrong, because right and wrong are features of the very order that the universe is. The Buddhist tradition took the moral order in a different but resonant direction, binding it to the law of karma. Karma, often misunderstood in the popular imagination as a system of cosmic reward and punishment, is in its precise Buddhist meaning a law of moral causation, the principle that actions, rooted in intention, have consequences that ripple through the structure of reality with the same law-like regularity that physical causes produce physical effects. A morally significant action is not an isolated event that vanishes when it is done. It conditions what follows, shaping the stream of consciousness and the unfolding of experience according to a law as exact, in the Buddhist understanding, as any law of physics. The moral order, for Buddhism, is not a set of commandments imposed from outside, but a structural feature of reality itself, the way things actually work, the lawful connection between the quality of action and the quality of what follows. To act with cruelty is not to break a rule for which one is later punished. It is to set in motion a causal process whose nature is suffering, as surely as releasing a stone sets in motion a process whose nature is falling. The emphasis on intention is crucial and distinguishes the Buddhist analysis sharply from any mechanical system of cosmic bookkeeping. The Buddha is recorded as teaching that it is intention, cetana, that he calls karma. Having intended, a person acts through body, speech, and mind. The moral quality of an action lies not in its external form alone, but in the quality of mind from which it springs in, whether it arises from greed, hatred, and delusion, or from generosity, kindness, and clear seeing. This is a moral order of extraordinary inwardness, one that locates the root of right and wrong in the very texture of consciousness, prior to any outward deed. The opening verses of the Dhammapada, among the most quoted lines in all of Buddhist literature, declare that all states of being are preceded by mind, led by mind, made by mind, and that suffering follows an impure mind, as the wheel follows the foot of the ox, while happiness follows a pure mind as a shadow that never departs. Here is the moral order rendered as exact law, not a decree enforced by a judge, but a structural feature of how consciousness and reality interlock, as reliable as gravity and as impersonal. The flinch is the mind's immediate recognition of the quality of intention behind a contemplated act, the felt registration that this intention is of the kind whose nature is suffering, that to act on it is to move against the lawful grain of how minds and reality actually relate. The flinch, in this framework, is the mind's immediate registration of the karmic quality of an action, the direct perception that this act is of the kind that generates suffering, that violates the lawful order of how conscious beings flourish. And Buddhism, like the Hindu tradition, identified the inner factors by which this perception operates. The Abhidharma, the systematic Buddhist psychology, names hiri and ottappa, moral shame and moral dread, the instinctive recoil from what is unwholesome as the guardians of the world, the mental factors that arise spontaneously to protect the mind from harmful action prior to any deliberation. These are the flinch, named and analysed with a precision that anticipated the modern science of moral intuition by 2,000 years. But Buddhism went further, into the cultivation of bodhicitta, the awakened heart-mind, the aspiration to attain liberation not for oneself alone but for the sake of all sentient beings. Bodhicitta arises from the dissolution of the illusory boundary between self and other, the recognition echoing across this entire investigation that the suffering of others is not categorically separate from one's own, that compassion is not a sentiment imposed upon a fundamentally selfish nature, but the natural expression of seeing reality as it truly is. The moral order for Buddhism is not arbitrary because it is grounded in the actual structure of consciousness and its connection to all other consciousness. To violate it is not to break a rule but to act against the grain of reality, and the suffering that follows is not punishment but consequence, the lawful result of acting in contradiction to the way things are. The Christian tradition, drawing on both its Hebrew roots and its absorption of Greek philosophy, developed the doctrine of conscience into one of the most sophisticated moral psychologies ever produced, and at its centre stands the claim that has echoed through every part of this investigation, that the moral law is written on the human heart. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Romans in the 1st century, made the claim explicit. Even those who never receive the revealed law, he wrote, show that its requirements are written on their hearts, their consciences bearing witness, their thoughts accusing or defending them. The law is not only on tablets of stone, it is inscribed on the inner substance of the human person, present even in those who never heard it taught, because it belongs to the design of the human being rather than to the accident of instruction. This is the theological form of the universality that the cross-cultural science independently discovered, a moral sense present in every human society, emerging before instruction, native to the creature rather than installed by the culture. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, gave this inheritance its most rigorous form. He distinguished synderesis, the innate and unerring disposition by which the human mind grasps the first principles of morality, from conscientia, the application of those principles to particular cases. Synderesis does not reason its way to the knowledge that good is to be done and evil avoided. It simply knows it. As a starting point given to the practical intellect, the way the first principles of logic are given to the theoretical intellect. This is the flinch, located in the structure of the rational soul, a moral knowing that comes first, that is not derived from anything more basic, that functions as the bedrock of all moral reasoning. And Aquinas placed synderesis within a vast architecture. The moral law that conscience perceives is the natural law, and the natural law is the participation of the rational creature in the eternal law, which is nothing other than the ordering wisdom of the source of all being. The structure is precise and breathtaking. There is an eternal order in the mind of the ground of reality itself. That order is reflected in the structure of creation as the natural law, and the human conscience is the faculty by which the rational creature perceives, however dimly, its participation in that eternal order. Conscience, for Aquinas, is quite literally the perception within the human person of the order, woven into the structure of reality by its source. The flinch is the eternal law, touching the soul. In the 20th century, the writer and scholar C.S. Lewis gave this ancient argument a fresh and forceful formulation that has persuaded many. Lewis observed that human beings everywhere appeal to a standard of fairness and right that they expect others to acknowledge, that even those who deny objective morality in theory invoke it the moment they are wronged, protesting that what was done to them was unfair, as though appealing to a law they expect their opponent to recognize. This universal appeal to a standard above the parties, Lewis argued, points to a real moral law that human beings did not invent and cannot fully escape, a law they find themselves answerable to rather than authors of. And a law, Lewis reasoned, suggests a lawgiver. An order of obligation pervading the cosmos suggests a source of that order. Whether or not one follows Lewis all the way to his theological conclusion, his starting observation is precisely the phenomenon this investigation began with: the flinch, the inescapable sense that some things are genuinely wrong, the appeal to a standard that we discover rather than create. Lewis simply pressed the question of where such a standard could come from, and concluded that a moral law woven through reality is best explained as the expression of a moral source behind reality. The same conclusion, in the vocabulary of modern apologetics, that Aquinas reached through the architecture of eternal and natural law, and that the Vedic sages reached through rita, and that the whole chorus of traditions has been singing across the millennia. The Daoist tradition of China approached the same reality from its own direction, through the concepts of the Tao and Di. The Tao, the way, is the ineffable source and order of all things, the deep pattern by which reality unfolds, which cannot be captured in words or rules but can be perceived and aligned with by one who becomes still enough to sense it. Di, often translated as virtue, is the moral power that flows through a person who is aligned with the Tao, not virtue as obedience to a code, but virtue as the natural radiance of one who has come into accord with the way of things. The Daoist sage does not consult a rule book. The sage acts through wu wei, effortless action that flows spontaneously from alignment with the underlying order, doing what the situation requires without the friction of calculation, because the sage has become transparent to the Tao. This is conscience understood, not as the application of principles, but as direct attunement to the order of reality, the moral life as the surfacing within the person of an order that pervades all of nature. The Daoist flinch is the Tao itself, moving through the aligned person, recoiling from what violates the way. The recoil is not the sage's private judgment imposed upon the world. It is the world's own way registering its violation through a person who has become clear enough to let it pass through undistorted. These four great rivers, the Hindu, the Buddhist, the Christian, the Daoist, are joined by tributaries from every tradition that ever examined the moral sense, and the convergence among them is the most striking fact of all. The Stoic philosophers of the ancient Mediterranean held that the cosmos is pervaded by logos, the rational ordering principle, and that conscience is the fragment of that cosmic logos seated in the human breast. To live rightly is to bring one's reason into accord with the reason that governs the whole. The Jewish tradition speaks of the moral law as the will of the Creator, inscribed in the order of creation and in the human heart, and of the human being as bearing the image of the divine, which grounds the obligation to honor every person. And the Islamic tradition, though it receives the briefest treatment here, contributes a concept of remarkable precision: fitra, the innate primordial nature with which every human being is born, including an inborn disposition toward recognizing truth and moral goodness, the claim that conscience is part of the original constitution of the human being, woven in at creation rather than acquired through experience. The tradition holds that this primordial nature can be obscured or covered over by habit and circumstance, but never wholly erased, that beneath every distortion the original disposition toward truth and goodness remains, awaiting recovery. It is a concept that maps with surprising precision onto the scientific finding that the moral sense emerges in infancy, before instruction, a native endowment, present from the origin, that culture shapes, but does not create. The Hebrew scriptures contribute the foundational image from which much of this Western development flows, the human being created in the image of the divine, Tselem, Elohim, bearing within the created order a stamp of its source. This image grounds the inviolable dignity of every person and the obligations that dignity imposes, and it locates the moral law not in human convention, but in the structure of creation as the work of a moral creator. The Hebrew prophets thundered against injustice, not as a breach of custom, but as a betrayal of the cosmic moral order, established by the one who made heaven and earth the same fusion of the cosmic and the moral that the Vedic seers, expressed through Rita, arrived at independently in the deserts of the ancient Near East, and the Stoic Logos completes the circle from the side of Greek philosophy. The rational principle that orders the cosmos is the same principle that speaks in conscience, so that to live according to nature, the Stoic ideal, is to bring the small reason within into harmony with the great reason that governs all things. Across all of them, despite vast differences of metaphysics and vocabulary and culture, the same structure appears: a moral order that is real, objective, woven into the nature of things, and a human faculty that perceives it from within. The traditions disagree about much: about the existence of a real moral order, about the reality of what the conscience perceives, about the flinch reaching something true rather than nothing at all about this. Across every barrier of language and metaphysics and time they agree. It would be dishonest to pretend that the traditions speak with one voice on every moral question, and intellectual integrity requires acknowledging where they diverge. They have disagreed, sometimes bitterly, about particular moral rules, about what is permitted and forbidden, about how the moral order applies to specific cases, about the boundaries of the moral community. The history of religion contains as much moral failure as moral insight, and the traditions have often betrayed their own deepest principles. None of this can be waved away. But notice what the disagreements are about. They are about the application, the specific content, the particular rule, the surface, in the language of this investigation, rather than the deep structure. Beneath the disagreements lies a remarkable agreement that there is a moral order at all, that it is not merely human invention, that conscience perceives something real, that the flinch reaches a truth. A skeptic might say that the agreement merely reflects the common evolutionary heritage of all human beings, the shared machinery that produces the moral sense in every culture, and that is possible. But the traditions, examining the faculty from within, across thousands of years, did not conclude that they were perceiving a quirk of their shared biology. They concluded that they were perceiving an order that genuinely structures reality, and the convergence of so many independent investigations on that single conclusion is, at minimum, evidence that deserves to be weighed rather than dismissed, the kind of convergence that, in any other domain of inquiry, we would take as a sign that the investigators were all perceiving the same real thing. So the traditions have given their testimony, and it is unanimous in its depth even where it differs in its details. The flinch is not yours. It is the touch within you of an order that does not belong to you, the cosmic order that the Vedic sages called rita, the dharma that holds the world and the self together, the karmic law that binds action to consequence with the regularity of physics, the eternal law that Aquinas saw reflected in the natural law and perceived through synderesis, the Tao that flows as virtue through the aligned person, the fitra woven into the human being at its origin, across every great civilization, examined from every angle by the finest contemplative minds the species produced. The conclusion is the same. That conscience is the perception of a moral order woven into the structure of reality, and that to feel the flinch is to make contact, however faint, with the deepest truth about how things are. The physics we have seen cannot prove this, but the physics has shown that the cosmos is the kind of ordered, informational, mind-hospitable reality in which such a moral order would not be out of place. And the traditions, walking the inner territory that physics shows to be real terrain, found there exactly what the physics left room for. What remains is to bring it all together, the science of the flinch, the limits of its explanation, the physics of the foundation, and the testimony of the traditions, and to ask, with full honesty about what can and cannot be known, what it means for you that the wrongness you felt may be a fact about the universe and not merely a feeling in your skull. That is the question that remains, and it is the question that touches your life most directly of all. For if the traditions are right, if the flinch is the touch of an order woven into the structure of reality, then everything changes about how you understand the small, insistent voice that judges your actions before you can argue with it. It is not the residue of your upbringing, to be outgrown. It is not a quirk of your evolved brain, to be discounted. It is not the arbitrary preference of a culture, to be relativized away. It is, the traditions insist with one voice. Your point of contact with the deepest truth there is the place where the order that holds the stars in their courses and the seasons in their turning reaches into your chest and tells you, faster than thought, that some things must not be done. The Vedic seers heard it as rita, the Buddhists felt it as the lawful grain of karma. Aquinas traced it to the eternal law. The Daoists let it flow as day, and every one of them staked the deepest claim a tradition can make, that to live in accordance with that order is to live in accordance with reality itself, and that to violate it is to set yourself against the structure of the cosmos. Whether they were right, and what it would mean for the way you live if they were, is the question we must finally confront. The science has been heard. The physics has been heard. The traditions have been heard. What remains is you. If the flinch is real, you are not alone in the universe. Sit with the weight of that, because everything this investigation has uncovered converges on it. You began with a simple experience, the recoil you feel when you watch cruelty done, the certainty that arrives before the argument, the wrongness you cannot weigh but cannot deny. And the question that experience raised turns out to be one of the largest questions a human being can ask. Either that flinch is a private event occurring in the isolated theatre of your skull, a flicker of evolved chemistry signifying nothing beyond itself, in which case the universe is exactly as indifferent as the bleakest reading of science suggests, and your sense that cruelty is genuinely wrong is a beautiful, doomed illusion. Or the flinch is a perception dim, fallible, but real of an order woven into the structure of reality itself, in which case the universe is not indifferent at all. The cosmos has a moral dimension as objective as its physical laws, and you are a being capable of perceiving it. These are the two possibilities. There is no third, and everything depends on which is true. It is tempting to think that the question does not matter for daily life, that whether conscience perceives or projects, you will go on feeling it either way and behave more or less the same. But this is a comfortable evasion, and it does not survive scrutiny. If conscience is mere projection, then there is no fact of the matter about whether cruelty is wrong, only the brute fact that we happen to dislike it, and every appeal to justice, every protest against oppression, every insistence that some things must not be done to anyone, rests on nothing firmer than a shared aversion that history could have made otherwise. If conscience is perception, then justice is real, oppression is genuinely wrong, and the moral claims that human beings have died for are claims about the actual structure of reality. These are not the same world. One can live in either of them, but they are not the same, and the difference between them is the difference between a universe in which the flinch means something and a universe in which it means nothing at all. We have walked the full length of the evidence, and it is time to gather it. The science of the flinch is settled in its essentials. The moral sense is real, ancient, embodied, universal across the human species, emerging in infancy before instruction, operating faster than conscious thought, anchored in identifiable structures of the brain, and non-algorithmic in a way that resists every attempt to reduce it to a code. That much is not speculation. It is the established finding of the neuroscience and psychology of moral cognition. The evolutionary account of where this faculty came from is powerful and must be honoured. The moral emotions were shaped by selection on creatures whose survival depended on cooperation, and their building blocks are visible in our primate relatives. But the evolutionary account explains the existence of the feeling without determining whether the feeling perceives anything true, and the attempt to use evolution to debunk conscience dissolves, on examination, into a universal acid that would destroy reason and perception along with morality, leaving the debunker with no ground to stand on. And the physics, when we descended to the foundation of reality, did not find the dead matter that would have settled the question against conscience. It found an order informational, fine-tuned, non-separable, open rather than closed, the kind of reality in which a moral order would not be out of place, and in which the old materialist certainty that value could be nothing but illusion no longer holds. Recall the strangeness of the timing, because it sits at the center of everything. The moral verdict arrives before the conscious mind has finished perceiving the situation, let alone reasoning about it a few hundred milliseconds, faster than the deliberative cortex can construct an argument. The narrating self, which believes itself the author of its judgments, is in truth their spectator, receiving a verdict already rendered from somewhere deeper and faster than itself. This was humbling when we first encountered it, and it remains the crux. For the question of what renders that verdict, what in you knows the wrongness before you do, is the question of whether that deep, fast, pre-conscious faculty is merely an evolved reflex or a genuine organ of perception. The neuroscience can locate where the verdict is rendered. It cannot tell you whether the verdict is true, and the traditions, examining the same swift inner movement from within, insisted that its very speed was a clue that conscience outruns reason because it is not reasoning at all but seeing, and that what is seen so immediately must be, like the immediate deliverances of the senses, a contact with something real. These two pillars, the openness of the physical foundation and the limits of what evolution can explain, do not build the conclusion, but they clear the ground on which it can stand. And then the traditions spoke with a unanimity that crossed every barrier of culture and language and time. The Vedic seers, who named the cosmic moral order rita and dharma. The Buddhists, who bound the moral order to the lawful working of karma and intention. The Christians, who spoke of the law written on the heart and the eternal law behind it, perceived through synderesis. The Daoists, who pointed to the virtue that flows from alignment with the Tao. The Stoics with their cosmic logos, the Hebrews with their image of the divine stamped on every person, the Islamic concept of the fitra woven in at creation. Across all of them, beneath every disagreement about the surface, a single conviction about the depth, that conscience perceives a moral order that is real, objective, and woven into the structure of things. This is the case for the proposition that conscience is woven into space-time. It is not a proof, but it is a convergence of the science, the philosophy, the physics, and the testimony of the deepest contemplative traditions the species has produced, and a convergence of that magnitude deserves to be weighed with the utmost seriousness. And now the objections, stated as forcefully as their proponents would state them, because an investigation that flinches from the strongest case against its own conclusion has not earned the right to that conclusion. The first objection is the most powerful, and it has a name. It is the argument from evolutionary debunking, and it says that everything we have called perception is merely projection. The moral sense feels like the perception of an external order. The objection runs, but feeling is not evidence. The sense would feel exactly that way, whether or not any order existed, because selection built it to feel compelling in order to motivate cooperation. We perceive faces in clouds and agency in the rustling of bushes, because brains that over-detected patterns survive better than brains that under-detected them. Perhaps the moral order is the grandest such projection, a pattern we cannot help seeing, written by us onto a cosmos that contains nothing of the kind. This objection cannot be dismissed, and honesty requires conceding that it might be right. The most that can be said in reply is what was said before, that the same logic, applied consistently, would debunk every faculty we have, including the reason that constructs the objection, and that we do not, in fact, treat the evolutionary origin of vision as proof that we see nothing real. The reply weakens the objection. It does not destroy it. The possibility that conscience is projection rather than perception remains genuinely open, and any honest person must hold it open. But hold open, too, the consideration that tips the balance back. The debunking argument assumes that an evolved faculty, shaped for survival, is thereby disqualified from tracking truth. Yet the clearest cases we have of faculties that do track truth, sight, hearing, the capacity for logic and mathematics, are every bit as evolved, every bit as shaped by survival as the moral sense. We do not conclude that the eye sees nothing real because eyes evolved to help organisms survive. We conclude the opposite, that the eye tracks real features of the world because tracking them was useful. By the same logic, the moral sense may track a real moral order because perceiving it was useful, because beings who correctly perceived how they ought to treat one another cooperated more successfully than beings who perceived nothing or perceived falsely. The evolutionary origin of conscience is not evidence against its reliability. It is, if anything, what we would expect if conscience were a perceptual faculty tuned to a real feature of the world. The debunker must explain why the moral sense, alone among our evolved faculties, should be treated as systematically deceptive, and no such explanation has ever been given that does not, by its own logic, indict every other faculty along with it. The second objection is the problem of moral disagreement. If there were a single objective moral order, the objection asks, why do human moral codes differ so widely? Why has slavery been accepted? Why have the boundaries of the moral community been drawn and redrawn? Why do cultures clash over the deepest questions of right and wrong? Does not the sheer diversity of moral belief suggest that morality is a human construction varying by time and place, rather than a perception of one fixed order? This too must be taken seriously. The reply is that the diversity is real but shallower than it appears. Beneath the disagreements about application lies a remarkable agreement about structure, that fairness matters, that gratuitous cruelty is wrong, that loyalty and honesty and care have moral weight, and that the history of moral progress looks less like the arbitrary drift of fashion, and more like the gradual correction of error, the slow widening of a circle of concern toward what the moral order arguably demanded all along. We do not say that the abolition of slavery was merely a change in taste. We say it was a discovery, a getting right of something that had been gotten wrong, and the language of discovery, of error and correction, only makes sense if there is something there to get right or wrong. Still, the objection has force, and the matter is not closed. The philosopher Peter Singer has written of the expanding circle, the historical widening of the boundary of moral concern, from the family to the tribe to the nation to all of humanity and, increasingly, beyond the human altogether. What is striking about this expansion is its direction. It does not wander randomly, it moves, haltingly and with terrible reversals, in a consistent direction, toward the inclusion of more beings within the scope of moral concern, toward the recognition that the suffering of the stranger and the enemy and even the animal counts. If morality were pure convention, we would expect no such direction. Conventions drift, they do not progress. But the moral history of our species looks less like drift and more like the gradual perception of something that was always true but only slowly seen, that the circle was always meant to be wider than we had drawn it, that the excluded always had the moral standing we denied them. This is the signature not of invention but of discovery, of a faculty slowly correcting its own errors as it perceives its object more clearly. The Jain insistence on ahimsa toward all living things, articulated thousands of years ago, stands as an early and radical perception of where the expanding circle leads. The disagreements are real, but the trajectory through them points toward a truth being uncovered, not a fashion being followed. The third objection is the deepest and the most honest, and it is the one this investigation must concede most fully. It is simply this, that the entire case is a convergence of structural parallels, and that structural parallels are not proof. That the cosmos has an order does not entail that the order is moral. That information is fundamental to physics does not entail that moral information is real. That the traditions agree does not entail that they are right. They might all be perceiving the same projection of the same shared evolutionary inheritance. Every step of the argument establishes a resonance, a parallel, a compatibility, and none of them, nor all of them together, amounts to a demonstration. This is true. It must be said plainly. The case that conscience is woven into space-time is not a proof, and anyone who tells you that physics has proven the existence of an objective moral order or the existence of God is overreaching in exactly the way this channel refuses to overreach. What the case offers is not proof but something more modest, and in its way, more honest, a demonstration that the proposition is reasonable, that it coheres with the deepest findings of science and the deepest testimony of contemplative experience, that the universe revealed by physics is hospitable to it, and that it cannot be excluded by any argument that does not also exclude too much. That is what the evidence supports. It is less than proof. It is far more than nothing. There is a fourth objection that deserves its own hearing, the most technical and in some ways the most stubborn. The worry that no account of what is can ever establish what ought to be, that the gap David Hume identified is truly unbridgeable, and that therefore no discovery about the cosmos, not its fine-tuning, not its informational foundation, not its non-separability could ever ground a moral obligation, because all of these are facts about what is, and obligation belongs to the realm of ought. This is a serious philosophical point, and it cuts against any attempt to derive ethics from physics. But notice that it cuts both ways. If no is can establish an ought, then the materialist cannot use the facts of physics to establish that there is no moral order either. The absence of value cannot be read off the equations any more than its presence can. The is-ought gap, taken seriously, does not favour the bleak conclusion over the hopeful one. It simply tells us that the question of value is not settled by physics in either direction, which is precisely why the testimony of conscience, the direct perception of the moral order from within, becomes not less important but more. If the ought cannot be derived from the is, then it must be perceived directly, if it is perceived at all. And the perception of the ought, immediate and universal and ancient, is exactly what the flinch is. The is-ought gap does not refute conscience. It explains why conscience must be a perception rather than a deduction, why it comes as a flinch and not as the conclusion of an argument. And here the investigation connects to everything else we have explored, because this question does not stand alone. It is one face of a larger inquiry that has run through every topic we have examined. When we explored the question of free will, we found the same structure, a self that experiences itself as an agent, a chooser, a source of action, set against a physics that seemed to leave no room for genuine choice. And we found that the quantum foundation of reality is open rather than closed, that the old determinism that would have made freedom an illusion no longer holds. The same openness that makes room for free will makes room for conscience, for a moral order that the free agent can perceive and act upon. The two are halves of one picture, a being genuinely free, perceiving a moral order genuinely real, and able to align with it or violate it. Conscience without freedom would be a cruel joke, the perception of an obligation one could not choose to honour. Freedom without conscience would be a void, the power to choose with nothing to guide the choosing. Together, they describe what it is to be a moral agent in a moral universe. When we explored the fine-tuning of the cosmos, the improbable precision of the constants that permit a universe of stars and chemistry and life, we found a physical order that appears oriented, from its foundation, toward the emergence of mind. The moral order extends that same insight one step further, a cosmos fine-tuned to produce conscious beings, and woven through with an order of value those beings can perceive, is a cosmos that looks less like an accident and more like the expression of a purpose. When we explored information as the foundation of physical reality, the discovery that the world is at bottom more like structure and code than like inert stuff, we laid the groundwork for understanding how a moral order itself, a kind of information, a structure of how conscious beings ought to act, could be as real as the physical laws, which are themselves information of a kind. When we explored the observer, the strange participatory role of consciousness in bringing the quantum world to definiteness, we encountered the same reversal that conscience demands. Mind, not as a late accident in a material world, but as something woven into the foundation, present at the root of things. And when we explored the biological antenna, the possibility that the brain is less a generator of consciousness than a receiver of it, we prefigured exactly the claim the traditions make about conscience, that the moral sense is not manufactured by the brain, but received through it, a perception of an order that exists beyond the perceiver. The connections run further still. When we explored the question of purpose and meaning, whether the universe is fine-tuned not merely for life but toward a purpose, we were asking, in another vocabulary, the very question conscience raises, whether the cosmos contains direction, value, and orientation toward the good, or whether it is blank and aimless. A universe with an objective moral order is a universe with a purpose woven into it, and the two investigations illuminate one another. When we explored the deep unity beneath apparent separation, we uncovered the physical correlate of the moral truth at the heart of every tradition's ethics, that to harm another is to harm oneself, that the boundary between beings is not the final fact, that compassion is the recognition of a unity that is really there. When we explored how the divine might act in a physical world, the openness of quantum law that leaves room for meaning and purpose to make a difference, we built the framework within which a moral order could exert real influence, rather than floating impotently above a closed machine. Each of these investigations was a window onto the same landscape, seen from a different angle. And the landscape, viewed from all of them together, is a cosmos that is ordered rather than chaotic, oriented rather than aimless, unified rather than fragmented, open rather than closed, and hospitable at every level. Science has been able to probe to the mind that perceives it and the value that mind perceives. The conscience is not an anomaly in such a universe. It is a clue to its deepest nature. Every one of these investigations was a facet of a single question. Whether the universe is the dead machine of the old materialism, or whether it is shot through, at its foundation, with mind and meaning and value. And every one of them returned the same answer, that the dead machine is not what physics found, and that the ancient intuition of a cosmos alive with order and purpose is more compatible with the evidence than the bleak picture that briefly seemed to be the verdict of science. So let the question come home, because in the end this is not an abstract matter, and the traditions never treated it as one. What does it mean for you, for the way you live? If the flinch is real, if the wrongness you feel when you watch cruelty done is a perception of the actual structure of reality and not a flicker of meaningless chemistry, it means, first, that your conscience is not to be despised. There is a cast of mind, common in our time, that treats the moral sense as something to be outgrown, a residue of childhood conditioning, a set of hang-ups to be transcended, an obstacle to freedom and pleasure and success. The traditions, with one voice, and the evidence, on careful examination, suggest the opposite. The conscience is the most precious faculty you possess, the organ by which you perceive the deepest truth there is, and to deaden it is not liberation but blindness, the willful destruction of your contact with the moral structure of the world. To honour the flinch, to attend to it, to refuse to silence it when it is inconvenient, is to keep faith with reality itself. Consider how this reframes the ordinary moral struggles of a life. The temptation to betray a trust, to take what is not yours, to look away from suffering you could relieve, to treat another person as a means rather than an end. In each of these the flinch fires, and in each the calculating mind sets to work constructing reasons why, in this particular case, the flinch can be safely ignored. Everyone does it, no one will know, they deserved it. It is only this once. The lawyer of the intellect is endlessly resourceful in defending the client that self-interest has already chosen, and the practice the traditions prescribe is to recognize that voice for what it is, not the voice of conscience, but the voice that argues against it, and to grant the flinch the authority it is due. This does not mean the flinch is infallible. It can be miscalibrated, and part of the work is the careful examination of where it has been distorted. But it means that the burden of proof runs the other way from where self-interest would place it. When you feel the recoil and find yourself reaching for reasons to override it, the very reaching is a signal worth heeding. The flinch is the first witness, and the first witness, the traditions insist, is usually telling the truth. It means, second, that the conscience can be cultivated, and that this cultivation is perhaps the most important work a human being can undertake. Every tradition we examined agrees that the moral sense is not static, that it can be clouded by self-interest, dulled by repetition, distorted by ego and fear and appetite, or it can be clarified, sharpened, refined through discipline into an instrument of increasing precision. The Hindu speaks of purifying the buddhi until it perceives dharma clearly. The Buddhist speaks of training the mind until wholesome and unwholesome are discerned with immediate accuracy. The Christian speaks of forming the conscience, the Daoist of becoming transparent to the Tao. The practical instruction that emerges is consistent across all of them, and it is this: pay attention to the flinch. Do not override it carelessly. When you feel the recoil and are tempted to argue it away because honoring it would cost you something, notice that temptation and be slow to yield to it. And on the other side, examine your conscience for the places where it has been deadened or distorted, where self-interest has taught it to fall silent, where prejudice has taught it to flinch at the wrong things. The cultivation of conscience is the lifelong labour of bringing your perception of the moral order into ever clearer focus. And it is, the traditions insist, the labour that matters most. The methods the traditions prescribe for this cultivation converge as remarkably as their metaphysics. The first is stillness, the deliberate quieting of the noise of desire and distraction in which the flinch is drowned out. The Taoist becomes transparent to the Tao through emptiness and quiet. The Christian contemplative seeks the silence in which the still small voice can be heard. The Buddhist trains attention until the movements of the mind become visible with clarity. In the noise of a hurried and grasping life, conscience is easily overridden. In stillness, it becomes audible. The second method is honest self-examination. The regular, unflinching review of one's own actions against the perception of the moral order, the practice, the traditions, variously call examination of conscience, mindful reflection, or the accounting of the soul. To look back at the day and ask where the flinch fired and was ignored, where it should have fired and did not, is to refine the instrument through use. And the third method is action itself, the practice of honouring the flinch in small things, so that the faculty is strengthened rather than atrophied. For conscience, like a muscle, grows through exercise and withers through neglect. The person who overrides conscience repeatedly in small matters will find it has fallen silent when the great matters come. The person who honours it faithfully in small things will find it clear and strong when everything depends on it. This is not mysticism. It is the practical psychology of the moral life, attested by every tradition that ever took conscience seriously, and confirmed by the ordinary observation that moral sensitivity is cultivated or destroyed by the habits of a life. And it means, third and most profoundly, that you are not alone. This is where the investigation arrives, and it is worth stating without hedging, even as we remember that it is offered as the testimony of the traditions and the most reasonable reading of the convergence, not as a proven fact. If the flinch is real, then the universe is not indifferent to the difference between cruelty and kindness. The order you perceive in your conscience is the same order that structures the cosmos, and to feel it is to be in contact with something vast, something that does not begin or end with you, something the traditions across all their differences agreed to call by their highest names. The Hindu would say that the witness within you, who feels the wrongness, is not finally separate from the consciousness that grounds all reality. The Christian would say that the law written on your heart was written by the author of the heavens. The Stoic would say that the reason in you is a fragment of the reason that governs the stars. They are saying in their different vocabularies the same astonishing thing, that when you feel the flinch, you are touching the moral structure of the cosmos, and that the cosmos, in that moment, is touching you. You are not a lonely island of value in a sea of indifferent matter. You are a place where the universe perceives its own moral order, and that, if it is true, changes everything. There is a particular consolation in this that the traditions understood and that the modern world has largely forgotten. To feel that the moral order is real, woven into the structure of things, is to be relieved of a terrible loneliness. The loneliness of believing that one's deepest moral convictions are merely private preferences shouting into an indifferent void. When you stand against cruelty, when you refuse to participate in an injustice, even at cost to yourself, when you honor the flinch, though honoring it brings you nothing, you are not, on this understanding, indulging an arbitrary sentiment. You are aligning yourself with the deep order of reality, taking your stand on the side of the structure of the cosmos itself. The martyrs and the reformers and the quiet ordinary people who have refused to do wrong when wrong was easy and profitable, they were not, the traditions insist, fools clinging to an illusion. They were perceiving truly and acting on what they perceived, and their lives were therefore not absurd but profoundly meaningful, lived in contact with the realest thing there is. This is the gift the traditions offer, held out with one voice across the millennia, that your conscience connects you to something that does not begin or end with you, and that to live by it is to live in truth. Return, one last time, to the train. The man reaches into the bag, the wallet rises, and something in you moves the flinch, faster than thought, older than your reasons, the recoil that arrives before a single argument forms. You have spent this entire investigation learning what that movement might be. The neuroscientists showed you its machinery, the evolutionists showed you its history, the physicists showed you a cosmos strange enough to contain it, and the traditions, across 3,000 years and every continent, told you what it is. The touch, within you, of an order woven into the structure of reality. The moral law that holds the world together, making itself felt in the small theatre of your chest. Perhaps they were wrong. The case is not proof, and an honest mind holds the possibility open. But perhaps, and the convergence of all this evidence, makes it more than a mere perhaps they were right. Perhaps the flinch is real. If it is, then you carry within you a faculty more precious than any other, the perception of how things ought to be, in a universe where ought is woven into the structure of what is. You did not make it. You cannot fully silence it. It was there before you could explain it, and it will be there long after your explanations have run out. It is older than your reasons. It may be older than your species. It is as old, the traditions say, as the order it perceives, as old as the cosmos, as old as the structure of the world. Attend to it, cultivate it, refuse to deaden it when deadening it would be convenient. Let it sharpen, across the years, into an ever clearer perception of the order you are here to uphold. Because if the traditions are right, and the physics has left the door open for them to be right, then to live by the flinch is to live in accordance with reality itself. To honour it is to keep faith with the deepest truth there is. You will not need a laboratory to find it, or a telescope, or an equation. You will need only to pay attention to the movement that has been there all along, the one that came before your reasons and will outlast them. And the next time you feel it, the recoil, the certainty, the wrongness that needs no argument, you will know what you are touching. You will know that you are not alone. You will know that the order which holds the stars in their courses has reached, in that instant, into you. The flinch came first. It always comes first. And it may be, the traditions insist, and the cosmos does not deny, the truest thing about you. Listen to it. It is older than you are, and it knows the way home.